Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 26th of February 2025. Today, we're delighted to be looking at the issue of the lifetime ISA, which was introduced under a previous government and has now been going for a number of years. And we think it's time to have a review of how well this interesting hybrid product is working, because it is both a product to help people purchase their own homes for first-time buyers, but also, to a degree, a pension product. So it straddles quite a lot of interesting areas. And we're really delighted to have a fantastic first panel representing really the issues of consumers and also some very experts, with great expertise in this area. Delighted to welcome Martin Lewis, the founder and executive chair of Money Saving Expert, who really doesn't need an introduction. And thank you for sparing the time from your busy life. And likewise to Funmi, Olufunwa, who's a finance expert and founder of Hoop Finance. So welcome to you and thanks for giving your time too. And Michael Johnson, who is a research fellow, but was also one of the architects of the initial version of this. So I think from your evidence, Mr. Johnson, what has turned out as the lifetime ISA isn't exactly what you originally proposed. So I wanted to kick off with a simple question that I touched on there at the beginning. And if I can work from left to right, starting with you, please, Mr. Lewis. This is a hybrid product that's got a complexity of design because it's trying to do two things at once. Do you think that's a problem? And if so, what could you do with the current product to try and resolve that?
So I think the Lifetime ISA has been a very successful product for first-time buyers, though has some major holes. And I'm sure we'll come on to later the getting rid of the withdrawal penalty, which is one of the core ones. But the idea you can get £1,000 a year free towards your first home has been very useful. And in this age where we have the need for a deposit, a 5% deposit, although preferably a 10% deposit, which is why the Lifetime ISA is so useful, I think it's been beneficial. The pension-linked element, or more accurately, the retirement savings-linked element, is a problem. And it caused the unintended consequence. There are no major providers who offer lifetime ISAs. You cannot get it from a high street bank. You cannot get it from a high street, any main provider. So you're talking fintech and modern innovative finance organisations. Now, while that is very good in its own right, the lack of availability, the lack of marketing from mainstream financial providers means that it has not had the take-up it should. And the very simple reason they won't do it is they think they're going to be done for mis-selling. And they'll be done for mis-selling because if you ask me who should use a lifetime ISA for retirement, I would say no employee unless they've maxed out their auto-enrolment, because that smacks the pants off the lifetime ISA for retirement savings. No higher or top rate taxpayer, because the tax benefits on retirements on pensions are way better than the lifetime ISA. And it's roughly equal between a lifetime ISA and a self-employed person on basic rate tax. Now, for all of those reasons, you can see why, when the huge majority of the population should always be saving first in a pension, that the banks, with all the mis-selling campaigns, and hey, I've been at the forefront of making sure that if they're irresponsible, we pursue them to try and take that money back, that the banks have gone, we just don't want to touch this because we're going to get people telling us they used it for retirement savings, and in 20 years they'll say, you should have told me to get a pension. And that has been a real problem. Now, I don't have a specific issue with the duality of the product. I think I understand why it was brought in and the idea, but there has to be a way to limit the liability, make sure there's proper communication at the point of sale so that we could bring in some of the big financial institutions. I don't know if you have any of them giving evidence. I think it'd be useful because we need to know what is it that would turn the corner to enable you to say, yes, we will offer lifetime ISAs. But in reality, the lifetime ISA is almost invariably a product that first-time buyers get for their savings. I got a question this morning on social media from someone asking me, they've kept it open, can I now use it for retirement savings afterwards? To which I said, yes, but if you're an employee, I strongly suggest you look at going to your pension first, because that's likely to be better for you. And that confusion and difficulty of conversation and complexity of product isn't helpful for something that's meant to be mainstream. Okay. So overall, there shouldn't be a problem, but it's been structured in a way that creates a problem.
Okay, so Funmi, Olufunwa, you've set up an organisation because of financial literacy issues, and I think Mr. Lewis has very clearly set out some of the challenges of someone selling this product to somebody. So what are your views on this hybrid product?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Martin has said, and Mr. Lewis has said. But what I would also... Thank you. But what I would also add to that is when we're looking at it from the retirement income or the retirement income perspective, I do think there is a concern that there is a cash element or cash version of this. I think we all know that if we're looking at long-term savings, doing that with cash, there's the impact of inflation. So by allowing that to happen or providing a product for that, is there a risk that we're almost sort of saying this is a good thing to do? So when we're looking at from that perspective, I think that it doesn't really work as well. And as Mr. Lewis has said, Martin has said, there are other things that are better for that. I do think that people should have choice. I don't think they should be forced to do things or use products that they don't want to. But I do think that for that particular element of it, it doesn't work as well as other things could.
I'm tempted to go. I'm just going to ask you one more question because of the background. You talk about the financial literacy issue, and actually we have a lot of talk about lazy capital, but there is a big impact on this compared with a pension because of the rate of increase. Do you think people understand that? From your experience of Hoops Finance, understand the difference between leaving something in a cash savings investment versus a stocks and shares investment?
No, I don't think enough people fully understand the impact of that. I don't think enough people understand the impact of inflation. I don't think enough people understand about investing. I think we have a huge issue, and that's why I set up my organisation, of lack of financial literacy. And I think if we're going to have a product like this, and we want people to make informed choices, we do need that to underlie those choices.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Johnson.
I disagree fundamentally with something that Mr. Lewis has said because it's factually wrong. The majority of people in this country are basic rate taxpayers whilst working and will become basic rate taxpayers in retirement. If one has a choice between a lifetime ISA and a pension product with identical investments in the two, then the lifetime ISA will produce unambiguously a 17.6% better return. Full stop. And that is because of the differences in tax treatment. Up front, the tax relief and the bonus are economically equivalent. And this is the first point about communication challenge. A 25% bonus on a lifetime ISA is the same as 20% tax relief. At the rear end, when one's drawing down or withdrawing funds, of course the lifetime ISA is entirely free of tax. The pension pot, 25% is tax-free, the other 75% will be taxed at 20% for the vast majority of basic rate taxpayers, who are basic rate taxpayers. That results in a 17.6% better return for holding a lifetime ISA. Now, Mr. Lewis referred to mis-selling. Yes, I think there is great scope for mis-selling, but it's not perhaps the way that we think of it. And the second aspect of major difference between those two product arenas is, of course, to do with the free option concerning early access for the purchase of the first home. So I want to make this crystal clear. The lifetime ISA is an economically better product than a pension pot for the vast majority of the population. Full stop. Now, if I may, Madam Chair, row back to the origins.
Can I just, as you've mentioned, Mr. Lewis, I just think it would be helpful if I could hear Mr. Lewis' perspective.
Yeah, I think if my duck had legs and barked, it would also be a dog. And I think that's the equivalence that you've just given. Look, the lifetime ISA, first of all, the majority of basic rate taxpayers are employees and therefore have a match contribution through auto-enrolment. There are also many people who aren't. So we're not talking the majority of the country. We're talking a minority who are self-employed basic rate taxpayers. You said under equivalent investments. There aren't the equivalent investments generally in lifetime ISA products as there are into pensions. So what you're saying, if the product worked well, I think you have a legitimate argument.
Yeah, just to be, when you say you, it's just helpful to say.
Sorry, Mr. Johnson. But the product doesn't, and it's not me who's saying it's missold. There is a very practical, obvious example of the risk, and the fact is no big banks offer this product because they're worried about being done for mis-selling. I would love you to persuade them, and you sound wonderful to do so, but in the practical, I work in the real world, not on paper. In the real world, they don't offer the product. So it's a false equivalence.
Okay, I'm going to bring in a lot of interest in this suddenly. Mr. John Glenn and Mr. John Grady, MP.
Yeah, can I just sort of try and zone in on the possible differences? Mr. Lewis there has spoken about the fact that under the auto-enrolment regime you've got this 5%, 3% employer contribution. Doesn't that mean that in fact that it isn't like for like? And if in an environment the pensions provision is much more underpinned with a sophisticated provision of non-cash products, whereas the LISA provision, it's not the provision for reasons that Mr. Lewis said around, the market risk around it, means that in practice, though it might not be desirable, the reality is that the pensions environment is much more sophisticated, and with that additional 3%, Mr. Lewis is right with respect to the lack of equivalence of the two products.
I think introducing the workplace arena, which is the assumption that we're all making here, is that within the automatic enrolment framework, there is automatically a contribution from employer and employee going to the pension pot. Yes, but there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't include the lifetime ISA in that same regime, as was originally proposed in the papers I put to the Chancellor in 2014.
I mean, your extensive written evidence does point out the fact that the LISA as it evolved with the penalty and these other rules isn't what you put up.
Absolutely
so
not.
I mean,
there are four major differences. It'd be very helpful to air them, actually.
Yeah. But I mean, I think we do need to get on the record the fact that in reality, the way that with auto-enrolment, and you have the employer contribution alongside the other, it doesn't really make them equivalent. It's very, very misleading to say that, surely.
I disagree, because there's absolutely no reason, and this is, in reality, many people have both products. It isn't the question of A or B.
Well, isn't it effectively, Mr. Johnson, isn't it really a better supplementary vehicle for basic rate taxpayers?
I think it's a complementary vehicle.
For those who've got enough money to...
But let's be clear, and this is something that profoundly influenced the catalyst for even writing about something called lifetime ISA, was how do people behave in reality? And in 2012-14, when this initial thinking was put together, if one talks to the under 35s, they prioritise first home ownership above everything else. And it's perhaps a pleasant coincidence that last month Standard Life produced the result of a major survey about behaviours. So we're talking about real-world behaviours. And they concluded that up to the age of mid-30s, first home ownership ranks way above any other objective for the saver. So in designing the lifetime ISA and presenting it to the Chancellor as I did, I was taking that fundamentally into consideration. And yes, we have a chameleon product. But crucially, the saver is in control. The saver can decide, is this a relatively short-term savings product for me to be able to afford what I primarily am interested in, which is home ownership? If so, I can go down that route. Alternatively, I can think of it as a pension pot. And I can leave it alone until I'm 60, I can accumulate those bonuses, and then I will have a considerably better return on that pot relative to, for example, a SIP.
Okay, well, there are obviously issues where people can't use it for the first and end up being trapped in second, but we'll come to that in a moment. Ms. Olufunwa, there's been a lot of heat here. Would you like to just comment on that particular point before I bring in Mr. Grady on the point of disagreement between Mr. Lewis and Mr. Johnson?
I think Mr. Johnson's obviously done has extensive knowledge in this area. I still, though, believe that if you're looking at the two, the using either a pension and contributing towards a pension, or using the lifetime ISA for your later income in retirement, I do still think that for the majority of people, it would be better for them if they were using the non-cash version, when you're looking at the two, a pension would be better. But if you're looking at the retirement income, I do still think that we need to go back to kind of directing people, I guess, towards the stocks and shares version.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Mr. John Grady.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg. I guess my question to each of the panel, and it's really rather a yes-no answer, I hope, is the minor disagreement we've seen between Mr. Lewis and Mr. Johnson turns on a range of modelling features: tax in, tax out, whether you get employer matching contributions, your investment choice, whether that investment choice is available, whether you can actually go to a provider and get a worldwide tracker for the 40 years or whatever. But if a busy mum or dad with a young kid was watching both of you have this discussion, would it not illustrate the essential truth here, that it's all too jolly complicated for individual savers?
Yes, clearly, and that's why the idea of doing some type of academic research to defend a legacy that's something you came up with 20 years ago that hasn't worked like that in practice is complete nonsense.
And a yes-no answer from maybe Ms. Olufunwa as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the work I do, when I do my finance workshops, one of the two top topics that people want to talk about or want to try and understand better is pensions and how to get on the property ladder. When it comes to pensions, a lot of people don't understand how they work. They don't necessarily appreciate how their workplace pension works. They don't necessarily appreciate that there's a difference between the state pension and the workplace pension. They can also, if they want to, take out their own personal pension. There is so much that is not understood. And yeah, there's a lot of complexity when it comes to these types of products. So to your point, I guess a busy parent, would be like, this is quite confusing.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Rachel Blake, MP.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, you said that this product had been successful for first-time buyers. Any more or less successful than any other comparable products?
Well, there's only one comparable product, which is the Help to Buy ISA. And, I have a whole graph I do on my show when I compare the two, because both two are still available right now. The basic summary is the Help to Buy ISA is far more flexible because you can put money in and take money out when you like. You could use it much more quickly. But the bonus is much bigger on the Lifetime ISA. The Lifetime ISA also allows you to buy a bigger house, up to 450,000. Help to Buy ISA is only 250,000 outside London. The one other difference that was really important in any changes that are made should maintain, the Help to Buy ISA was paid at exchange. That was a big problem. The Lifetime ISA is paid at completion, which is correct. The problem with the Lifetime ISA, and that we all need to recognise, is the penalty for withdrawal. Now, I have no problem with the withdrawal penalty in its own right. I have a problem with it for first-time buyers buying a house. So what we have is a succession of young people who are saving in the vehicle they have been encouraged to save in by the state, who are then trying to use their savings to buy a first-time property, but due to house price inflation, their property has just tripped above the £450,000 level. And then not only do they not get the £1,000 a year bonus they were intended to get, which I understand and it's legitimate as a threshold, they are fined by the state effectively 6.25% of their own money in order to withdraw that money to get the cash out. And the problem with that is not just for the individuals who it affects. When I do television programmes on the Lifetime ISA, I have to warn people about that. And when I warn them about that, because you have to have the caveat, you should only save in this if you are definitely going to buy a property under £450,000, instantly we have a huge drop out in the number of people who get it. So the sentiment that does is very negative. Generally, in every other way, the Lifetime ISA is potentially superior, but not in that way, and that needs to change.
We're going to come to that, I think.
But very briefly, the government is spending £500 million on this. Is this the best thing that they could do? Because there's other things that the government can do with that money, and I'm interested in whether or not it's the right thing that they should be doing.
Looking purely at first-time buyers, right, I'm far less bothered about the retirement element. We don't have many people who seem to use that, and I don't get many questions about it from the public. Focused on that, I think because we have it in place, because it is there, it is a good use of the money if it were fixed and it were improved. Now, if you ask me if we were drawing it up from a blank slate, would I go there? Well, I haven't done the work on something equivalent. But we're not on a blank slate. I just live in the practical world. We've got a LISA, it's got a brand, people use it. Lots of people who've succeeded on it talk about it in a positive sense. My big concern is as we push towards more people buying homes and we try and free that up, everything we do to pump money in the housing market has some counterproductivity because it increases house prices, so there's a level of defeat. I have a concern that both the current and past governments have consistently used the narrative of pushing people to buy houses with a 5% deposit. 5% deposit means you get an expensive mortgage. I would try and push people up to 10%. The lifetime ISA is quite a useful vehicle to actually give people the opportunity to go one step further, up to 10%, to increase the cost of the mortgage and to give them a little bit more financial security in the long run. So I can't give you an answer because I haven't done a full study of what could we do better, because I've been looking at this product in its own right. But I think from where we are now, if we fixed some of the major holes, this could work really well, and I think Mr. Johnson's legacy would live on well.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Dean, Mr. Bobby Dean.
Thank you. I'm going to disclose at the beginning that I'm a lifetime ISA user, and I did actually use it to help save for my first flat. But I will admit that now there's 70 pence sitting in that account, and it's been that way for a number of years. So I guess my question, first of all, maybe I can start with you, Funmi, is my experience common? Have a lot of people done that, essentially empty their accounts out to buy the first home and left them, or are you seeing different patterns of behaviour, or what percentage of people are making use of it after purchasing a home?
Olufunwa.
So the majority of people that I talk to about using the LISA, the lifetime ISA, are doing it to buy their first home. The people that have money in the lifetime ISA who've already bought their first home, it's because they effectively weren't able to use the LISA. So maybe they were buying a home that exceeded the £450,000 cap. Yeah. So they made a choice. Do they actually lose the bonus and some of their own money and take the money out and use that, or do they leave it in there? Some people have been fortunate, I guess, to still be able to buy the property without the LISA money, so they've left it in there. Yeah. A small minority of people that I speak to have intentionally used the lifetime ISA for retirement savings, but that is the small minority. The vast majority, it's because they want to use it to buy property.
Okay, Mr. Lewis?
From my experience, I'd say exactly the same. I don't have data on it. I can poll on it by tomorrow morning if you want me to.
Yes, please.
Can I get my phone out now?
We'll have it minuted, I'm sure. Mr. Johnson, I mean, I think everybody has this impression of the product behaving in this way. Most people are going for the first-time buyers. I appreciate you're putting forward good arguments for why somebody might want to use it as a retirement product. But wouldn't it be more straightforward for us to just split the product? And to have one solely focused on the first-time buyer purchases, and maybe a very similar product that you can market in a different way to the pensions market? Would that not be the best way forward?
I think we have far too many products out there already. May I just debunk a myth, which is the impact that the lifetime ISA is having on property prices? If one actually gets some data and crunches it, last year, the lifetime ISA drawings contributed less than 1% of the capital was spent by first-time buyers. I suggest to you that has minimal impact on the pricing of housing. And I think the question that you've just asked concerning behaviours subsequently, maybe once one has bought a home, it's too early to tell. Let us be clear, this thing's only been going since 2017, and in the early years there's going to be next to nothing in it anyway. And I think maybe it's a question we ought to revisit in a decade's time.
Just to come back to my core question then, is your primary argument then there's too many products out there already, so we don't want to add another retirement product in, even if you think this product has more value than others? Is that your core argument to not splitting up the product?
It's not my core argument is to go right back to the beginning and state clearly why was the lifetime ISA launched. And it was partly as to put a foot into the water to test, ultimately scrapping all pensions tax relief.
To shift the liability later, was it?
No, nothing to do with that. It's to do with the fundamental question that we, as a society, accept that income tax is progressive. Therefore, tax relief is regressive. And the distribution of tax relief, which we all look at every year, I'm sure, is hugely skewed to those who least need it. The lifetime ISA, by introducing a bonus that is disconnected from tax-paying status, was absolutely the first step to doing away with all pensions tax relief, and ultimately the merger of the ISA and pension worlds. That is why it was launched, amongst other reasons. Brexit then intervened.
I think my colleague might pick up on that, but I just want to have one final broader question, and it speaks a bit to the value for money element, as Ms Blake was explaining. Is one of the benefits of this product the actual behaviour that it generates, the saving habits that it generates? I'm going to reflect on my own experience. Trying to save for a home is hard, but if you've got a product that makes it difficult makes you think twice about withdrawing from your savings, but also incentivises you with that bonus element, it keeps you locked into that savings habit a bit stronger than you would do via other products.
That was absolutely yes. Sorry to interrupt, but this is a very important point about behaviour. The fundamental point and behavioural aspect of the lifetime ISA is the saver can choose. Am I going to, once I have that product, well, let me step back. If I'm a 30-year-old thinking about pension or ISA worlds, if I put money into a pension, I know for certain I can't get it until I'm 57. Therefore, that is a barrier to saving within that framework. Lifetime ISA was presented with the argument, you can always change your mind.
Yeah, I guess the
point and therefore the penalty, and I totally agree with Mr Lewis, the penalty is a nonsense.
We will come back to
absolutely
the penalty.
Not.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. We will come back to the penalty element. I guess the question I'll ask the rest of the panel is, there is potential that the government could design a different product that maybe offers a similar financial incentive. But is there anything unique about this product that you think should be retained in whatever the government might come up with if it decides to abolish it?
Exactly, Mr. Dean.
Mr Lewis.
Mr. Lewis.
I think conceptually, the idea from the time was this lifelong savings product. That was sort of the theory that you would, but it was given two notes, right? For a house, for a pension. It wasn't given more flexibility, which I think I remember being discussed at the time with the Chancellor, maybe not what you came up with, but clearly there were other ideas going on in Parliament, and I do think, shifting the liability later down the path was also something that the Chancellor at the time was quite interested in doing, if I remember it rightly. But I think the idea of a lifelong savings product was within this. Now, of course, we have that within ISAs generally. An ISA is something that you put money in, you're allowed to put a certain amount in each tax year, and then stays tax-free year after year after year to bring the savings habit. This is, an ISA on steroids, if you like, because you get the £1,000 bonus on top, so it encourages young people to get straight into the savings habit. And I think that is beneficial. Where I don't think it works particularly, or hasn't worked in practice, I understand all the reasons why it should have worked, but hasn't in practice, is the continuity once people take their money out for a first-time property. I think there are a lot of people with their 70p's in there. I suspect there are very few people with much more than 70p in there once they've bought their first-time house. I will do some polling on that, but intuitively, I would be surprised if that was anything more than 10 or 15% of people.
Thank you very much, Mr Dean. Dame Harriet Baldwin, MP.
Thank you, Chair, and I should declare that I was a Treasury Minister at the time that this was announced in the budget, and I think it's very interesting for me to look now 10 years on and see what's worked and what's not worked, what could be improved. And I wanted to draw out a little bit more on the withdrawal penalties. We heard very clearly from Mr Lewis his case for it not being penalised if you do happen to just go over the 450. I wanted to assume that both the other panellists both agree with that in terms of you'd like to see that reform to the withdrawal penalty, would you, Mr Johnson?
The proposal I put was the withdrawal charge was 20%, i.e. no penalty. Yeah. And therefore the introduction of the penalty, which of course is implicit, not explicit, and there's great miscommunication around this subject, was an unpleasant surprise when it was launched.
So there is agreement from all three of our panellists that you'd like to see that modification, and there was experience during the pandemic of a 20% withdrawal penalty. And are you in favour of that, of reverting to that? Is effectively what you're saying?
So absolutely. Just because I know there are people watching, just to say that the key is many people think if you add 25% and take off 25%, you get back to where you started. You don't. You end up with 6.25% less than where you started. If you add 20% and then have a 20% withdrawal penalty, roughly you get back to where you started, which is why when we say no penalty, we mean a 20% penalty, which means you just don't get the bonus because of the way the scheme is structured.
So the COVID model, basically.
Yeah,
the
COVID model
language. Sorry, you don't mean a 20% penalty. You mean a 20% withdrawal charge?
I mean, in the real world, it's a penalty. I don't work in your academic world. I communicate to proper people who understand how the products work.
I think it's very clear. It is very clear where
you knew what I was talking about. You didn't need to pick it up, mate. Right?
Okay.
Shall I carry on?
Chair, I think, then we keep things seated. Mr. Lewis.
So I think where we have to go now, the question, the nuanced question, which is one to design, is when you charge 20% and when you charge 25%. Under the current system, when you charge 20% and when you would charge a 25% penalty. Under the current system, it's always 25% penalty. Now, what you could do is you could drop it so that whenever you withdraw your money from a lifetime ISA, you have a 20% penalty. So effectively, you get back what you put in plus the interest that you had. And that would give it sort of lifelong flexibility. You just wouldn't get the bonus. But as a bare minimum, and I would like to see that, and that may well be a useful trial experiment to see if it would turn into a lifelong savings product. But I think the urgent and the immediate action is to make sure that when someone is buying a house for the first time, the very worst case scenario is there's a 20% penalty, and that could be done through solicitors.
And I think you've made that point very, very clearly to the committee. And Ms. Olufunwa, would you make any other modifications to the withdrawal penalty?
No, I wouldn't. So, as in, I would agree that we should basically put people back in the position that they were in, that they're not losing any of their own money. So, and people are broadly supportive of this. Actually, they appreciate that if they're buying a property, for example, and it goes over the cap, and we can discuss what the cap should or shouldn't be. They appreciate that. Okay, fair enough. I don't get the bonus. But what really frustrates people, and they think is so unfair, is that they end up losing their own money. So people are doing the right thing.
Yeah.
They're doing the things that we've told them to do. They want to save for a property, and they're doing that. And then they feel that the rug is being pulled out from underneath them through no fault of their own, because they personally cannot control house prices.
So is it acting, the withdrawal penalty itself, if you can try and just focus on that aspect, is it acting as a deterrent to people from opening these accounts in the first place?
Yeah, it absolutely is. When I speak to people about this, and I've written down some of the words that people have used, because I think at the centre of all of this, we talk about data and we talk about figures, but it's people's lives. They want to buy homes. They want to buy somewhere that they can live, safety and security for their family. They want to start families and grow families. And there's a real human element to this that when I talk to people, they are really frustrated. They feel it's really unfair. They can't believe that the state is effectively doing this to them.
So that's the biggest deterrent, is it? The withdrawal penalty?
I think one of the biggest deterrents, because people say that they're actually, and I've written down what they're fearful. Someone actually said it feels like a bit of a scam. And one person said it's terrifying. I'm trying to make this decision, and it feels like a massive decision. I'm putting all of my money into this product, but I'm literally terrified that when I come to use it, I won't be able to, and then I'm going to lose some of my own money. So I do absolutely think that it's restricting some people from even opening them
in the first place.
Yeah.
Just to support every word that was said, what's really interesting when I've talked about this, and we get a large amount of feedback on the back of this, the people who are most put off this are those from risk-averse backgrounds, which tend to be people from the lowest income backgrounds. So I have educated middle-class students who've talked to me about this, and I talk about the penalty. They go, well, if I have to pay the penalty, I'll take the risk. I tend not, and I know this is anecdotal, but I tend not to get that from people from non-university backgrounds who are looking to save. For them, the risk of losing money is too great. So therefore, the nature of the penalty and the deterrent of the penalty is not just a problem in its own right, it's a social equality problem and a social opportunity problem, because it is a greater deterrent from those from less financially educated backgrounds.
And Mr. Johnson, more people last year paid this penalty than actually used their LISA to buy their first home. Do you regard that as a design failure?
It's certainly not desirable, and it wasn't in the original design. So yes, it's an implementation failure. But I think let's bear in mind, again, there's some interesting numbers that have appeared about the consequences during the 1 year when the withdrawal charge was cut from 25 to 20%. So in the year prior to that taking place, the average withdrawal on a monthly basis was about 3.7 million. In the final month of the year, when the charge was cut to 20%, it was 50.6 million. A dramatic change.
That was partly to do because it was COVID and people...
And that was obviously introduced because of the...
Because it also, just be clear, of course, it is taken into account if you're trying to claim universal credit, so people were having to withdraw because they couldn't claim...
And it was also that penalty withdrawn for everybody. It wasn't just for buying a first-time property. That was an open, you can get your money back.
Because people needed it. I mean, we had lots of constituents writing to us desperate to get them.
I think it's important to bear in mind that in parallel with the work you're doing, there is the Treasury looking at financial resilience. And this is a very good example, the lifetime ISA being brought in during an emergency situation during COVID, which greatly assisted in financial resilience, and it was achieved by reducing that withdrawal charge from 25% to 20%.
Thank you, Dame Harriet.
Can I just add one?
Please,
can I just add one point? So, some of the people that I've spoken to have said, in relation to if they've used it to save for retirement income, that when it comes to withdrawal penalty, if they're withdrawing before age 60 because of maybe poor health, so they can't work as much and they need some income, they also believe that in that instance there shouldn't be a withdrawal penalty because, again, it's your own money. You're being punished for something that, again, is outside of your control.
Of course, the only loss of the penalty, if you're within 12 months of dying, you lose, but not if you're just in general poor health.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We haven't seen that many examples of that because the product hasn't been going long enough for that.
There is a fear.
Yeah.
And again, that kind of points towards people maybe not being as willing to use the
Yeah.
product because of that fear.
Thank you very much. You and Young MP.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions related to distributional elements as well, and also the impact on means testing benefit entitlement on the LISA. The first is, I think, Mr. Lewis, you mentioned before that the most risk-averse individuals, particularly low-income individuals, will be put off investing in a LISA because of the withdrawal penalty. So I was wondering if I could hear from the three of you your sense of what is the typical demographic of the people who are actually using the LISA the most, and is the money that the government is spending, as my colleague Ms. Blake mentioned earlier, actually being spent in a progressive way? I'll start with Ms. Olufunwa first.
I'm probably not really in a position to say if it's being spent in the right way. I don't have enough information to comment on that. But I would say that in terms of the demographic of people that are using the LISA, it's a lot of people. It's, like I said, the majority of people that I talk to about it, they're using it for the intention of buying their first home. They're not thinking about using it for income when they're age 60 plus, unless they've effectively been forced to leave it in there.
And of those people who are buying it for their first home, do you have a sense of where they lie in the income spectrum?
I'd say it's a broad range. I think it's a broad range of people. I think for a lot of people, it's free money. So who doesn't like free money? So, once they know about it, and actually that's another point. The Help to Buy ISA was really, really well known. And I think the language helps. It was called the Help to Buy ISA. Mm-hmm. We have other products. For example, I know it's not related to the LISA, but we have the Help to Save product. It kind of does what it says on the tin. Lifetime ISA, for a lot of people, doesn't really mean anything. So a lot of people have come back to me, and when I talk about it, they're like, I didn't even know that existed. And I don't think how it's named is that helpful.
The name came about because the proposal for the product was it was going to be available from birth until death. That's why it's called the Lifetime ISA. And there was, again, it was a somewhat unpleasant surprise when it emerged, for me anyway, to see it.
Yeah, well, we've read your evidence, which is absolutely clear.
Mr. Lewis, what's your sense of the demographics who are using the product?
I have no distributional data, so I simply don't know that. But I do think this is an every person product. One of the things I often talk about is a great present for your child's 18th birthday is put £1 in a lifetime ISA, because of course you have the 1 year that it has to be open before you can get the bonus. So I tell everyone, get £1 in, and then when you're ready to use it, you don't have to wait a year, because if you're going to make rules that are a bit silly, not you, but Parliament, then it's my job to try and show people how...
officials, I suspect.
Which Treasury officials. And I'm sure some ministers signed it off as well too. But if that's going to happen, then it's the job, to try and get the public to use it in the way that can work best for them. So I think that 1 year system, I understand why it's in place, but getting people to think ahead. But lots and lots of, and this is one of the issues, parents tend to be, for the younger people, the ones pushing their children to get it. Right? Now, look, if you're 35, it's slightly different. But if you're 18, 19, 20, it is. And the number of people who say, how do I open one for my child? And my answer is, you don't. You give your child your money and they have to open one. It's their product, and that's the right way for it to do as well, is important. But we just don't have distributional data. I suspect your next session will do.
Mr. Lewis, when you said earlier that the withdrawal penalty puts off those who are most risk-averse, do you think that hits low-income people the hardest?
I have enormous amounts of feedback, but we don't filter them for demographics. That's the issue. But my intuition from those large amounts of feedback and the way that people write them to me, when you can tend to tell who understands the finance a little bit more and who understands our finance a little bit less. As with all things, the more financially educated you are, the more you tend to engage in products. The less financially educated you are, the less you would tend to engage in products. And when there is an off-putting thing like a penalty, that will disproportionately go to those who are less financially educated, who tend to be those from lower income backgrounds. There's a lot of ifs and buts in my sentence, but intuitively that would be the way I would see it.
Thank you. And Mr. Johnson, any thoughts on the distributional effects of this?
I've got, it's not something I've looked at, and I don't have access to that sort of information. But if I may suggest a nudge or possibly a shove in terms of behaviours, if we go back to the wonderful days of child trust funds and £500 that was in there to begin with, that was the proposal for the lifetime ISA as well. Didn't happen. And I was, again, sad not to see it happen.
And just to be clear for anyone watching, the child trust funds now defunct funds.
Have gone, and that's why the plan was to resurrect it.
And there are a number of children with money in there who don't have it. So thank you, Ms Young.
600,000. Go to gov.uk if you want to trace your old child trust fund.
Indeed, other committees have done some work on this, absolutely worth highlighting. Rachel Blake MP.
Thank you very much, Chair. To Ms Olufunwa, we are thinking about the price cap and the impact that that's having. For great swathes of London and the South East, this product is essentially irrelevant. Mm-hmm. So you've talked about wanting to increase the property cap. What impact would that have on opportunities for people who want to buy their first home in London and in the South East?
In terms of using the lifetime ISA, I think it would give people the confidence to actually use it. I think it would depend on the way in which the price increase was implemented. I think we need to give people the assurance, or as much assurance as possible, that if they save into this product, they're not going to then be hit with a penalty or losing some of their own money. So if they can actually see figures which seem to make sense in the context of the properties that they're looking at, then I think people will be more encouraged to use the lifetime ISA product.
Are there other categories that might help? For example, bedroom numbers that could be equivalent caps to use of the fund?
I've not really thought about that. Potentially, I think we'd need to go back and have a look at that. I think what we need to remember is that people are buying homes or buying their first home later and later, and they're getting older and older, and they're not necessarily buying the sort of starter home that they might have bought decades ago. So it's no longer sort of a one-bedroom flat with no garden. It may now be they're buying in a couple, or they might already have a child or want to grow their family. More people maybe now have blended families. They might have children as stepchildren. So the types of homes that people are looking at as a first home is very different. They're generally bigger, and therefore they're generally more expensive.
The median house price in my constituency is £1 million. How could that be?
We should say that Ms Blake represents the cities of
London
and Westminster. City and Westminster, so she is in a particular.
Your constituents to come and live in Richmond. They would be very welcome.
There will be people in my constituency who are not able to buy their first home, and who it's important to stay within communities that are just minutes away from here. Mm-hmm. So how could you make the case for value for money when with such a significant median house price?
I mean, I think there does have to be some sort of cap. I think we have to be reasonable about how this product is going to be used. I mean, the average property price of £1 million is a lot of money. I'm not suggesting that would be the cap. But I think we need to look at maybe average house prices in different areas and use that to help. If we look at the 450,000, that was back in 2017. Property prices have probably increased by around about 30% since then. So if we kind of were to inflate the cap to reflect that, we're looking at around, I think it's about £585,000 as an average. Now, we could do something, I guess, a little bit similar to the Help to Buy ISA, where there was an inside and an outside, but I think even that is not necessarily as helpful. Maybe we need to go a bit more granular and look at different areas and have different caps that way. Or we could just have the average. I think we need to look at different ideas.
Thank you.
I'm struggling to understand what consumer purpose the house price cap serves. What is it trying to achieve?
I think there's my view is that there's an overall value for money for the taxpayer on the overall price cap. I think that there are my view is that there are trade-offs to be made around where you would allocate public subsidy into this form of incentivising home ownership.
The average, and average is a dangerous word, but I'm afraid it's the data that we tend to have. The average price for first-time home in the last decade has doubled. Now, if we go back to the time when the thinking was going on, which was approximately a decade ago, and though I certainly didn't advocate a house price cap, maybe we should double the one we've got.
Okay. So you would be proposing to double the cap?
I propose to get rid of it, but if you'd like to have one, then I suggest if you want to be consistent with the doubling of first-time house purchases prices in the last decade, then we should double the cap.
I certainly think there might be some issues for ministers on that, but Mr. Bobby Dean,
but just on this, the costs to the Treasury of this product are tiny.
Well, Mr. Bobby Dean,
I wanted to pick up on that. I mean,
so just finish on that. But there are alternative uses of what you present as comparatively tiny. There are alternative uses, and that's the function.
Can I answer on this question?
I'm going to follow up. So maybe if I can ask a follow up.
Go Mr. Lewis, and then we'll come to Mr. Dean.
So it was £500 million in the last tax year, but we all kind of accept that the product's not being taken up at the rate it could be. And so hopefully, if we fix that problem, and maybe all the major high street banks get involved, it will be taken up by a lot more people, and that'll be good for those people, but it will cost the Chancellor Exchequer a lot more. And I'm not sure how the public will react if that's being used to buy £1 million homes, for example. So I think I accept that not moving the cap at all could create a long-term disincentive for savers, because it might take them 10 years to save their home, and the uncertainty about whether or not they're going to meet the cap in 10 years could be a problem. So the cap probably does need to move. But how much does it need to move by, and should there be a hard limit to this? Should it be able to purchase any home whatsoever, no matter how expensive, or should we be thinking about the distributional impact of this?
I think it's worth remembering, first of all, that on your £1 million home example, the £1,000 a year from a free lifetime ISA is nothing. It's irrelevant. You're going to be looking at £50,000 or £100,000 deposit in the first place, so you're going to have to raise the funds elsewhere. I'm not sure how it would help people. I understand philosophically, I understand Mr. Johnson's argument of why you wouldn't have a cap at all, because it's the same for everybody, and the problem, the bigger the house you buy, the more you're going to have to raise funds separately. But it's not going to, being practical, no Chancellor's going to sign it off, and it isn't going to happen, so it's probably not worth considering. What I would say, I think we got a little bit confused. We need to be very careful. The argument over the level of the cap is a subsidiary argument to the withdrawal penalty. If you have a withdrawal penalty, then the cap is absolutely crucial, and the fact that we have not increased it with average house prices year on year is a manifest unfairness that puts people off the product, gives people no transparency and no consistency. Now, if we park that for 1 second and say, let us look in a world where if you are buying your first-time property, you pay a 20% penalty, i.e. you get your money back if it's going to be above the threshold. Then the cap becomes a secondary measure, because what it doesn't do is put anybody off. What you can say to people is, you put money in this product, we now have all mainstream providers providing it, so it's more competitive, so interest rates will be better. And just like I say with the Help to Buy ISA now that has no penalty, there's no risk. Put your money in, as long as you're going to buy a house with it, and with the Help to Buy ISA you can take it out for any reason.
Outside London.
But there's still no risk in a Help to Buy ISA, because you can get your money out and you get your interest, you just don't get the bonus. If we had a lifetime ISA with no withdrawal penalty, apart from if you didn't, as long as you're buying a house, then the risk is that you choose not to buy a house as opposed to you choose to buy the wrong house. So I think you can't look at the level of the cap and the withdrawal penalty in isolation. You have to play two scenarios. with the withdrawal penalty, then the level of the cap is absolutely important, needs to be transparent, and needs to move up year by year. I would still want that if there was no withdrawal penalty, but if you ask me which cross I would die on the cross of getting rid of the withdrawal penalty for anyone who is buying a first home.
So, yeah, I accept that. And I mean, for the sake of this argument, it may well be worth accepting that the government has decided to do away with the withdrawal penalty, because I want to get to the point about the equity point. And Ms. Olufunwa, you said earlier on that it's free money, who wouldn't take it? Now, Mr. Lewis, you did say that, you know, a few £1,000s is not a big difference on a £1 million property, which is true, but if it's free money, then people may take it. That could be a dead weight.
Just to be clear, I think, Mr. Dean, for the sake of the British taxpayer, it's not free money, it is the taxpayer.
Of course, yeah. I was quoting.
It's a good bonus, yes, indeed.
But my concern is that actually people would see that as free money, and actually it's taxpayer money, and it becomes a dead weight loss to the Chancellor. So again, do we think that we need to have a hard cap on place just to protect the taxpayer?
I think it makes sense to have a level of a cap. I think it makes sense to have some form of cap, because I do appreciate that we do have to look at this from is this, you know, as we're all taxpayers, so is it the right thing to be spending our taxpayer money on? So I do believe there does need to be some level of a cap. I guess it's the question of what that cap is. Mm-hmm. And I do think we need to look at definitely increasing it from what it was back in 2017.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Mr. John Grady.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg. Just a very quick answer for me, because answers please, because time's marching on, and perhaps one at a time. But the SIP minimum pension age, I think, is currently 55 and going up to 57, if I'm right, in 2028. We've got a different state pension age, and then the LISA age is 60. Is this just another example of confusion in the pension saving landscape?
Absolutely.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you very much. One word.
The pension access should be 60 straight away.
Ms. Olufunwa.
You can see why I'm not a politician.
Ms. Olufunwa.
I think it does add to the confusion with the different ages for accessing, yes.
Mr. Lewis.
Absolutely.
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, simple agreement. Thank you very much, Mr. Grady. Mr. John Glenn.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Johnson, obviously, I know you well because we worked together in opposition. I should declare that 20 years ago, and I don't think that LISA would have existed without you. But I do understand that your frustrations that comes through, as I said, in your written evidence. Mm-hmm. But policy development has to interact with a legacy landscape and also a range of products. And if you think about pensions, you've got auto-enrolment, and maybe it hasn't got to an Australian level yet. You've got, you know, some provision for tax on interest. You've got, you know, the ISA allowance, which has been, we may come on to that, pretty consistent at 20,000. Isn't it the case that your vision really was for this to become an alternative, universal method of saving for pension and for housing? And if we did do that, the taxpayer generally, the burden on the state would be much, much less, because you could have a situation where somebody would get that £1,000 every year on top of their 4,000. They wouldn't then pay any tax on exit. As you say in your evidence, it was an EEE, exempt. But don't you then have a situation... I mean, the reality is that we've gone down the auto-enrolment route. We've got all these different socioeconomic groups with different incentives. We've got a different set of tax advantages according to how much income you have. That it was only ever realistic, unless you had that wholesale commitment to transfer the whole structure of pension saving in this country, it was never going to be more than a complementary or supplementary vehicle. And then my second question is, given the different inherent interests between a short-term savings product that's probably going to be cash-based in order, because you're going to get the money out quite quickly to put in a deposit, versus something that you want to, you know, actually put in equities or something with a higher risk profile if you're doing it before the age of 40 and you're not going to get to it till you're 60. That despite, you know, the desire to simplify, that fundamental different objective requires a different sort of vehicle and has a differently regulatory regime. So wouldn't it be better now to actually separate the two, get the one for house saving right, and actually leave this as a redesign it, as one of my colleagues said? Why wouldn't you do that, given the landscape that has evolved over the last 15 years?
Mr. Johnson, start with you.
I thought of I view the lifetime ISA as the first step in something like a 30-year journey to radically simplifying the pensions and savings arena in this country. It is ludicrously complicated. I don't think anyone in the room would disagree with that. The question is, how does one start that journey? And I thought it was really key to illustrate the benefits of disconnecting the incentive from tax-paying status, which addresses the regressive-progressive problem. So I think it's a question of interpretation, but I think we also need to be aware that the pensions industry was deeply suspicious of the lifetime ISA even before it was launched, because some within the industry took the view that this was a start towards an ISA-centric framework, full stop, which is not in the pension industry's interests.
Yeah, but wasn't it, though? It was, though, really, wasn't it? I mean, if this had reached its full extension as your 30-year vision would have had, everyone would have used this as the vehicle to save. They wouldn't have been taxed on the exit. You then have a whole issue around how you advise people, particularly people who aren't very familiar with these financial matters. And it would have fundamentally changed the legacy model that their systems have been built around, and the investment industry has been built around for generations.
Yes. But let us be clear that, in terms of the Treasury affordability, part of that vision was to do away with things like the ludicrous annual allowance, now 60k, which is irrelevant to virtually everybody in the country, and to bring that down to a number between sort of £5,000 and £8,000 a year. So if we look at the distribution of the incentive to save, be it through lifetime ISAs or pensions or whatever, we look at income distribution with the first 50%, the lowest 50% of the income distribution basically receiving nothing from the state because they don't save. And then it dramatically rises in the last 10 to 12%. I've always envisaged squeezing that down and pushing the toothpaste down to the lower end by dramatically curtailing the annual allowance. Yes, radically progressive, possibly not from somebody working perhaps for the Conservative Party at the time.
I was very sympathetic to it, I must say.
You're a good man, sir.
Yeah. I should just be clear that these are all interesting discussions. We're focused on the lifetime ISA.
Indeed, but the lifetime ISA was the first step to making that manifest.
But that's dead now, isn't it?
Yeah. So, in terms of splitting it, Mr. Lewis, where would you be? And then I'll come to
Well, look, I mean, we have split it anyway in practical realities. If you listen to what Funmi said earlier, look, when people ask me about the lifetime ISA buying for a house, what should I do with it? Well, you put it in cash, don't you? Because if you're about to do something in the next 2 or 3 years, in general terms, you're not going to invest in the market because you don't want to take the risk of crystallising at the wrong moment. So the right thing to do when you're saving as a first-time buyer is to put it in cash. The right thing to do if you're saving for your retirement is to have it in equities. The idea that there'll be this seamless transfer from cash to equities at the nodal point when you take your money out to buy it has not worked. Again, I haven't done the polling or the data yet, but in every instinct that I've got through it hasn't worked. So you would need some form of radical change to the structure and the encouragement. And yes, clearly what you're talking about is an idea no chancellor's been brave enough to do, to basically to get rid of the rewards for higher and top rate taxpayers from saving in a pension. And it would be a brave chancellor who did it, and it would be redistributive, and it would probably be beneficial. But I'm not sure that doing it through the back door through a LISA is everyone's going to go, oh, we didn't notice.
But the other side of Mr Johnson's proposal, and where it could go if it was ever seriously resurrected by the Treasury, would be that those that had amassed large amounts of money wouldn't pay any tax on exit, which is of course what they do if they have a massive pot. So there would be some compensation for wealthier people.
Look, I understand. For me, the idea was to try and get a sort of UK 401k type savings vehicle to go all the way through. But the way it works at the moment, because and listening to Mr Johnson, Clearly, there's been a death of 1,000 cuts from the original concept to what was brought in the first case, and all these different changes that came through. So the rather overarching strategic philosophical design that originally came in the LISA hasn't manifested in practical terms and is not how people use it. So you would have to do some quite radical change to get back to that. So I am agnostic as to whether you split it or not, because for me, it's a first-time buyer savings product.
I think we've heard that very much from Olufunwa. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, nothing.
Thank you. Lola McAvoy MP.
Thank you, Dame Meg. Just on that point specifically about the use of the product as it is now, if we were to split the product and accept that it's being used for first-time buyers, that's brilliant, and reform the second half of the second use of the product to be targeted specifically to self-employed people who are basic tax rate payers, do you think in those circumstances where we were targeting and encouraging, and that was the eligibility criteria, was that you had to be self-employed and you had to be a basic tax rate payer to use the savings product, do you think it would be fit for purpose as a lifetime savings product?
Who are you throwing at
to Mr. Johnson first, because your evidence said about 1 in 5 self-employed people not saving for a pension.
Yes, I think it's probably higher than that. I was in front of another committee in July 22 talking about specifically this, Work and Pensions Committee. We were proposing to introduce a self-employed ISA, which is the sort of thing I think you're working towards if you're talking about splitting. So yes, absolutely. And also to include that within the automatic enrolment framework.
Right.
And then the question is, of course, the devil in the detail with anything discussion to do with self-employed and encouraging them to save is, of course, there's no employer contribution. And therefore what we discussed, and this was with, I think Stephen Twigg was chairing at the time.
Stephen Timms.
Timms, I beg his pardon, was to make use of the difference between Class 1 and Class 4 NICs.
Yeah, and you laid that out very clearly in your evidence. Thank you.
Which was at that time 3%, it's now 2%, but to use that as a mechanism that if the self-employed did not make a 2% contribution through being having their self-employed ISA automatically enrolled, then the 2% would go to the Treasury. So it was a kind of a shove rather than a nudge.
Okay, sorry, and you were right, it's I think your evidence said 1 in 5 are saving for a pension of this set of self-employed people.
Yes, it's the other way, yes, as opposed to 80%, and it's a major issue. There are approximately 5 million self-employed. Yeah. And we've tussled around this particular theme for more than a decade, and to date no government has really been able to crack the problem.
Ms. Olufunwa, in your experience with TOOP, is it? Do you have many self-employed people coming in who are on the basic tax rate? Do you think it would be a suitable product for them as a pension alternative, or what's your view, given your stance at the beginning, for this group specifically?
Yeah, I think it potentially could be, but I guess going back to the point that I made around if you're saving for the long term, saving in cash is probably not the most financially sensible thing to do. So to use it for that, specifically for that purpose, to kind of discourage people away from saving it in cash.
But just on that point, would you then remove the cash element? And so it's a stocks and shares ISA or a cash ISA. So would you remove if it was for the long-term saving, remove the cash element, which is obviously, as we've outlined, suitable for your first-time buyers, but not necessarily for a 30-year long-term savings product. If you removed that, do you think in that instance, would it be a good product?
I think it would be, but I think we'd also need to make sure there was the ability for those people to save in another type of cash ISA. So we're not forcing them to only have long-term savings in stocks and shares, to have an alternative as well.
Okay.
I think we're rubbing shoulders here with the productive finance agenda. And obviously now's not the time to go into detail, but I would like to put it on record, I'm distinctly uncomfortable with the whole thing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Johnson. And Mr. Lewis, your views on it?
I am somewhat clenching my buttocks at the idea because, look, I did a programme on pensions the other day. We had, thousands of responses coming in. By far the biggest question that comes in about pension is consolidation. I can't keep track of all my different pensions from all my different employers and self-employment. You're adding another vehicle. You're adding a level of complexity. Now, if that vehicle could seamlessly be interlinked with the other things that were going on in there, I would be more favourable. But I don't see that happening. So I worry that you're just splitting the messaging of what you should do. that you're creating an additional choice when the type of people who don't save, the choice is what overwhelms people in the first place, and that you're going to have yet another I can't remember what I saved to in the past issue. And so while I'm sympathetic to the idea, because as a complex financial individual I like lots of choice and lots of different options, I think for the particular nut that you are trying to crack of people not saving, within the current regime, which I don't see changing, the general pension regime, on paper it would be quite nice if we did, but within the regime that we had, to add yet another thing in there, to add yet another question, you know, the biggest thing, about a third of the questions I get are what I call permission questions. They're where people explain everything that they want to do. You know, I get tens or hundreds of thousands of questions, everything they want to do, and they go, is that right? And if they don't get permission, they don't do. So by throwing something else in there, what you have at the risk is, but I don't know which one to go for, I just won't do either. That's my concern, not any sort of ideological objection to what you're trying to do, but just practically throwing something else in there to make people make a decision about.
I do take that point, just this final one, because I know we're short on time. I do take that point, Ms Lewis, because I share your ambition for clear communications and correspondence with the public. So if it's a communication issue and you feel like people wouldn't understand the new product, are there any products, do you think that with this 1 in 5 stat of self-employed people saving for a pension, the current status quo isn't working either. So what alternatives, I'm not saying to ask you to name a good product, but I just mean what alternatives to this community that we've outlined, self-employed basic rate taxpayers, what alternatives do they
I think what I would do is I'd focus on better communicating the existing products that we have. You know, we have a free guidance system at the moment, but they can't. You know, I had on my show the other day, I had an advisor and I had someone from Money Helper who was brilliant and can answer lots of questions. You know, the question they can't answer. So where should I get my self-employed pension? Well, here are the options, but where should I get it? Which provider? They can't answer that. You have to pay for a financial advisor. Financial advisors aren't taking one unless you've got £50,000 pension fund. So we have a gap when people just want to go, oh, just go and get a stakeholder pension at this one or one of these three. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't make that much difference.
If there's any reassurance, we are keen to look at the advice guidance boundary.
The argument should be that the government should be a trusted person to help you.
Government's never trusted.
But I know, but in an ideal world, that would be a suitable product, a government product.
Thank you, Mr. Boyd.
Thank you.
But, Mr Lewis, you probably have more influence over most people than the government in this domain. But the reality is, the danger of them being in a position where anything goes wrong with that advice, you also know that you'll be asked to campaign on getting the government to come back and do some sort of compensation. And
I think the issue with that is, right, well, look, putting money in a pension is putting money in a pension and the risk should be explained, but people should be putting money in a pension. I probably take a little bit of responsibility for what you were talking about earlier, people putting money in cash. I don't talk about investing, and I think it's probably not arrogant of me to say I'm the biggest name in this, right, when it comes to... I don't talk about investing because it's not what I do and I'm not a regulated financial advisor. Now, I often say... just because I don't talk about investing, I'll say on the telly, doesn't mean it's bad. It's just not my subject, so I don't talk about it. But I do have concerns that my own position, because I'm a savings person, therefore makes people think, well, investing isn't good. And we need more investment communication.
Where's the dividing line?
The regulation about it is so tight. Yeah. Right, that we just don't get the messages because, you know, instantly if I start doing anything out there, you get rent-sinking people going, oh, he's just told you to do that, I'm going to get you, you're breaking the FCA regulations. And you sit there going, all we're trying to do is encourage people that for the long term, probably better in equities.
And a separate area of our work, we are looking and keeping an eye on this advice guidance boundary discussion, including about how AI might...
We've been looking at this advice guidance boundary now for more than 2 decades. And the fundamental problem that I keep coming up with is that people are given guidance and they think they've had advice.
Yes. Right. Yeah. There's a lot. I mean, we could, much as we would love to get into this is, I'm afraid, not the time. But before we do finish, I did want to pick up on a lot of speculation at the moment in the media, this committee, not on me, and we don't have any inside track about the Chancellor's thoughts about the ordinary average cash ISA. The current limit, of course, is £20,000 to invest in that, and a lot of people use it and a lot of people like it. There's some discussion that might be reduced to talk about the whole lazy capital argument. I just wondered if you've got any quick thoughts, and then we'll go from left to right, if I may, from Mr Lewis to Mr Johnson, through just to make sure, to see what you think about the cash ISA and any changes to the limit and what impact that might have. Mr. Lewis, if I start with you.
Well, I've already had people telling me that they're worried about what's going on, so they're going to withdraw from cash ISAs, which is clearly not the right thing to do. Your money is in a cash ISA and it has that status in the long run.
So just to be clear, I mean, I think everyone, just to be clear for anyone who's watching, it's not likely that they would, what you've already got in there would be
Which
protected.
is, of course, what I have been saying and making very, very clear. I don't think we should reduce the cash ISA limit. I think there's also this concept that if you stop people saving in cash, they're going to put money in stocks and shares is false. I think also it's worth remembering we've had a long time of ultra low interest rates, of which the people who work very hard to put their money away in savings were penalised for effectively. Those very low interest rates really hurt savers. They're finally getting some things back. Many people who've worked hard all their lives living off that income. If you squeeze what people can take out of savings, either by lowering interest or by taxing them, then people have less money to spend, right? And it's not quite as simple logic as, you reduce interest rates or you reduce the amount of money people have and therefore they'll go spending more for savers and people living off their savings. So look, I wouldn't argue for an increase in the cash ISA. I just think that the idea of some of the investment banks who are trying to get rid of the cash ISA in order to encourage people to invest in stocks and shares. To invest people in stocks and shares, you need a cultural change. Lots of young people are putting money in Bitcoin, a highly risky speculation. It's not a form of investment, but it's got some hell of a bit of marketing out there. I don't think this is about let's try and starve people out of one foot to put money in the other.
So you're in favour of keeping the cash ISA as it is?
And better encouragement of investing.
Olufunwa.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think that there's a lot of speculation around at the moment, which I think is particularly helpful and can lead to people doing things that perhaps they shouldn't be doing.
Did you say particularly helpful or particularly unhelpful?
Sorry, particularly unhelpful. Thank you. Particularly unhelpful. And I think people like a bit of certainty, and they also want to feel that they can trust the government. There's a lot of people saying, people that I speak to, that are part of my community, they're saying that, well, actually, I'm not going to go from investing in a cash ISA directly to investing in a stocks and shares ISA. So what will happen is, if the limit comes down and I can't put as much money in, I will just have my money in a savings account. And then more people are saying, well, actually, is that the intention? Because then that can potentially be taxed. So I think we need to be really clear about what really is going to be the impact if there is a reduction in how much you can save into a cash ISA. And I don't think it's going to have the desired effect of getting people to move from investing from saving in cash.
I should stress that's all speculation.
All speculation.
Mr. Johnson.
I think this question rubs shoulders with the productive finance point I made earlier. I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that slashing the cash ISA allowance will then automatically trigger waves of sophisticated investing in stocks and shares. Let's not kid ourselves. This is fundamentally an education question.
Thank you.
And should be dealt with in the education arena.
Last very quick point, Ms. Olufunwa and then Mr. Lewis.
Sure. The last thing I would say is that actually for the majority of people, they're probably not actually using that full £20,000 allowance, but it's the perception of what a potential reduction could mean.
Thank you.
Just going back to the lifetime ISA, why should a 41-year-old who's never had the opportunity to buy a home not be able to open a lifetime ISA? Why is there an age limit of 40 for an opening a lifetime ISA? I think as people are buying properties at a much older age, I think it is age discrimination, and you've got to open it before your 40th birthday seems wrong to me. Can I just throw that in there?
Absolutely agreed.
Well, look, can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for a lively session. I'm not even going to attempt to sum it up at this point. We are now hearing from a panel of LISA providers, so we'll be interested to hear what they say. We've had an awful lot of really interesting written evidence as well, so I want to put on record my thanks to those who've submitted that written evidence, including the panel. Thank you very much indeed. Order. Order. Welcome back to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 26th of February 2025. We're continuing our conversation about the lifetime ISA, and we're delighted to welcome representatives of ISA providers. We have with us, from my left to right, Brian Baines, who's the Head of Personal Finance at Moneybox, Anne Fairweather, who is the Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Hargreaves, Lansdown, Charlotte Harrison, who's the Chief Executive of Home Financing at Skipton Building Society, and Richard Stone, who's the Chief Executive of the Association of Investment Companies, representing the wider sector. So I just wanted to kick off with I said the question before, but we have a product that covers both savings for a first home and then only withdrawal at a point of retirement. It's an odd hybrid product. Not lots of people don't provide it. Some of you do. You here do. Do you think there's a problem with having a hybrid product, and is there something that you would want to see reform? And I'll just start from left to right. Mr. Byrnes, if I start with you.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to give evidence today. I think the first thing to say that's context for all of my answers today is that the lifetime ISA is changing the saving and investing habits of a generation of young savers. We have got 1.5 million active lifetime ISA savers across the industry, 3 million nearly lifetime ISA customers that have benefited in some way since inception. These are people who are saving more, these are people who are investing, these are people who are supplementing their retirement savings, and these are people who are buying homes across the UK, nearly 250,000. They are doing exactly what we as a country would want them to do, and they are telling us that the lifetime ISA has made their savings habits more consistent, and they are telling us that the lifetime ISA has made them feel more confident about their financial futures. In terms of the dual purpose specifically, it was referenced on the previous panel. This is a lifetime product, and it is very early to be making an assessment of how successful the retirement option has been. We must remember, given the age profile of people who can open a lifetime ISA, people who are 18 to 39, their primary financial goal in life is getting onto the property ladder. That is what we see with our customers. That is predominantly why they open up the lifetime ISA. If you think about when you did purchase a house, you're fairly broke after you've done that. You don't necessarily straight away think, right, how do I top up my retirement savings? And despite that, the customers that we have seen who have used the lifetime ISA to purchase a home, 79% of them said they either plan or consider to return to the lifetime ISA in the future to supplement their retirement savings.
Just to be clear, so the base of that was all of the people who've got a lifetime ISA with you?
People who have already purchased a home, who have successfully purchased a home. 79% said, I either plan to or I may return to the lifetime ISA. From a Moneybox perspective, we have helped just over 100,000 customers onto the property ladder via the lifetime ISA. That survey, I believe the sample size was 3,100 specifically. We must make sure from a financial education perspective that that's the right decision for them, but that is an incredible number of people who want to top up their retirement savings going forward. And we have 12 million people in this country under saving for retirement before property costs in retirement are factored in. The last thing that we want to do is remove a valid and valuable retirement savings option from these people who want to return to it in the future.
It's fair with the same point to you.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I'd just like to thank the committee for shining a light on the lifetime ISA. I think it's a good product which has maybe lacked a bit of policy love in the last few years. And so it's precisely the right time to have a look at what's working, what isn't, and how to make it into an even greater product. So I think we very much share Brian's views in terms of what he's saying, in terms of people obviously are coming to this to buy their first home, but certainly that's the experience we see with our clients. There's an intention to keep that product open for the longer term. I should highlight that Hargreaves Lansdown's product is an investment one solely, so obviously that does make sense for that longer term. I think where we see most utility for this product in that long-term retirement savings vehicle is for the self-employed, but we do think there needs to be some changes to the way in which the product works, not least in terms of the withdrawal penalty, for that to be fully used, as well as with that age limit as well. So I think when looking at this afresh and sort of seeing what's worked, what hasn't, I think we'd say at the moment it's provided a really helpful vehicle to get a lot of people onto the housing ladder. That's incredibly important in terms of their longer term financial resilience and their resilience in retirement. So I think we should absolutely bank that win, and let's think about how to use this product in retirement, especially for people who have uncertain earnings, are worried about tying their money into a pension longer term, those self-employed people people who want that surety that they can get the money out earlier if they need to. And I think that's where you need a different kind of product for that kind of group. So I think that's one of the first reasons. And then secondly, certainly for people who have maxed out their workplace pension, it is a good vehicle for them to then save in addition to any workplace pension savings.
They could equally put it into a private pension instead of...
They could, but I think particularly for basic rate taxpayers is particularly helpful as a product. So yeah, there would be a decision to be made there.
Ms Harrison.
Rather than cover what we've just heard, I just want to build on a couple of points if I can. So I think you mentioned, we're 7 to 8 years into the product being live, so we were one of the first providers of the cash lifetime ISA. We know that from our perspective, 88 to 89% of those that are saving for a first home. And it is delivering on that intention. So 82% of withdrawals have helped a first-time buyer purchase their first property. To the point that Brian made, we are 12 years away from seeing the impact for those that are saving for later life. But I think, typically it takes 7 to 8 years on average to save and accumulate the wealth that is required for a deposit for a home purchase. So we're at the cusp of that now, and I think to your point it is welcome that we're having a review to understand how that's been operating in practice. And actually, from my perspective, this is a helpful, useful product that we do need to have some review from now, with a couple of amends, I think, to make it even better.
Thank you very much. We'll come to some of the amends. Mr. Stone.
Thank you, Chair. I should say we don't provide licenses as such with a trade body that represents listed closed-end funds, so hopefully one of the investment options that users of the product might choose. But I think where I'd start from is just a little bit of a step back, which is to say, what are we trying to achieve here? And it's about increasing people's financial resilience, encouraging saving and investing, and overall improving their financial position. And I think there's a general recognition, I think Mr. Byrnes said it just a moment ago, individuals are not saving enough. Those savings are too heavily based in cash, those long-term savings, and therefore returns are not where they could or should be. And we need to encourage a greater investment culture. And I think in the LISA, and this is where I'm probably going to disagree with my fellow panellists, we're recommending in our evidence that it is scrapped, because you are conflating two very different investment objectives. If you're wanting to save for a house purchase, that's a short-term objective. You should be in cash. You don't want to risk the capital value of your deposit. If you're saving for retirement, it's a long-term savings objective. You should be exposed to higher risk, higher return investments in that process. There's all manner of complexities in the product around the age limits on contributions and withdrawals, the house purchase, property cap, price cap, the timings of withdrawals, all very different to other ISA products. And I think when you look at the ISA landscape more broadly, and you've had the Help to Buy ISA, you've got the Innovative Finance ISA, you've now got the LISA, actually that complexity in itself, I think Mr. Lewis in the previous panel mentioned that, it's the choice and the range of options actually puts people off engaging at all. We need to simplify the process. We need to get back to the point where there is a simpler ISA product, a simpler pension product, and therefore that choice for people is much clearer, and therefore through that simpler choice encourages greater engagement and greater levels of saving and investment.
Can I just ask you, if you had a separate LISA that was for pensions, given and you had a different profile from the start around equities and not cash, it would be a perfectly proper alternative, wouldn't it? The only thing that is really in play here is the issue of the legacy providers in the pensions industry who don't want to have this.
It would. You could do that. I mean, I think the key for me is just understanding and setting out for consumers a very clear both objective and choice. I mean, I have separate views on the sort of pensions market that actually, we've moved everybody from or society from fundamentally a defined benefit system to a defined contribution system, where the risk has shifted from the state or the employer onto the individual, and we've never really explained that to people. So people aren't contributing enough.
The point is, you could have a LISA product, separate one, a for pensions, for long-term savings,
you could
perfectly reasonably.
You could, yeah, you could absolutely perfectly reasonably. I think my only comment back to that would be, if you're trying to encourage saving and investing, you want to make that choice as simple and clear as possible. The level of education is an issue, and financial education and literacy is a problem. Having a simple, focused investment ISA product as the ISA option would be a clear way of doing that, separate from your pensions market and pensions product, which you may wish to reform as well. I think the only other point I'd make, Madam Chair, was a point that Ms Blake made earlier around in the first panel around the cost to the Treasury. And I think all of these things we've got to look at, actually, if the purpose of this is incentivising people to buy their own home and enabling first-time home purchase, if that's seen as the principle, then is there another way of achieving that through the £500 million that this costs? Is there a better way of doing that, whilst at the same time encouraging greater engagement by getting rid of the complexity?
A quick one from Ms Blake, as you mentioned her.
Yeah, very, on this side of the panel, real support for the product. Our estimate is this is only about 6% of all ISAs. So I'm interested that you've got such a strong conviction about its success rates and performance if it's such a small proportion. And we estimate that about 13% of overall ISAs are, I would argue, failing through unauthorised withdrawals. So how do you think, does that compare to other ISAs where people are taking money out sooner than they might have expected?
So I think in terms of the take-up of the lifetime ISA, we have to recognise that it's actually exceeded expectations of the Treasury when it was launched. The volume of people that are saving into it is by no means insignificant. Again, when we speak to our customers, when we talk...
significant, but what's your definition of how are you measuring significance?
Measuring
it's a lot of people, but 6% isn't that many it isn't that large a share of the market.
I'm measuring it from 1.5 million young people actively making positive personal finance choices very early in life and putting themselves on an incredibly good stead and financial footing and financial security. 250,000 people getting onto the property ladder via the lifetime ISA is not insignificant. There are absolutely areas where we can make improvements to the product rules that haven't been looked at since 2017, so we can make this more widely taken up by more people, and more people can benefit from the lifetime ISA. But there was a question on the previous panel about who is benefiting from the lifetime ISA. From a Moneybox perspective, 80% of lifetime ISA customers earn £40,000 or less. So these are people who are on low to middle incomes. When we speak to the people, these are nurses in Liverpool, teachers in Cornwall. These are people who say, I never thought I could be a saver and investor before I got a lifetime ISA. I'm the first person in my family to get a mortgage. I'm the first person to be on the property ladder, that they wear with an absolute badge of honour. So those are the success metrics that I look at when we talk about the lifetime ISA and why we're passionate, given the data that we see day to day.
Thank you. Dean MP.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, just to follow up on your comment, actually, you said that you've described the huge benefits you've seen for the users of the ISA, and you've said it's too early to tell on the retirement product end. But what we heard from the consumer panel earlier was a concern that we actually might be restricting the pipeline of people that would take up this option to get the benefits for the first time property purchase because of the complexity. So people are confused. Mr. Lewis was explaining how he always has to explain the pensions end of the product, and that starts to confuse people and maybe put them off of going for that investment vehicle. So even if the lifetime ISA could be a good product for a pensions product, should we not separate it off so that we've got a much clearer market for something that you said is a real success for your users?
The idea of the lifetime ISA when it came out was that people would not have to choose. They could save for their first home or they could save for their retirement in the same product. My argument would be that there's a large volume of people that has worked really well for. And yes, there are areas where we can make the rules more simple, the withdrawal penalty being one of those. And I'd echo the previous panel saying that can be reduced from 25% to 20%, as it was during the pandemic. We did not see a large spike in withdrawals during the pandemic. The 20% government bonus that you would lose is enough to incentivize people to keep their money in a long-term savings product. So I would say there are areas where it can be made simpler, but I just really would like to emphasise the point that there are incredible things happening in the Lifetime ISA, and we need to build on the success of it by making these small rule changes that haven't been looked at since it was brought in 2017.
Yes.
What was Harrison?
Sorry, thank you. It was just a couple of points really, which was we're talking around having multiple choices out in the market, and also that we're trying to solve to some degree. I'll take the pensions element to one side, but for the entry level, which is how do I access home ownership? And for me, that's where the kind of stark reality is. So we've conducted our own research. We've got our own affordability index as part of Skipton Group, led by Skipton Building Society. 90% of first-time buyers that are looking to buy in their local authority area, cannot do so without some form of help. Now, typically that help comes in the form of bank and mum and dad. If you do not have access to bank and mum and dad, it becomes increasingly challenging to be able to save for a deposit. Lots of those people are also renting, and we know that aspiring first-time buyers can be spending more than 45% of their income on essential housing costs. So how to accelerate accessing we were talking on the panel before, 5, 10, 15% deposit is a real challenge. And for me, this is why I am passionate about this product. I think this is a good product that provides another route for people to support them in getting their deposit. And to the point around, is this sensible use of taxpayers' money, and could we utilise a different vehicle to enable that, perhaps? But equally, we also know that with every housing transaction, we are supporting economic growth. So this isn't just about this point in time. Our current LISA balances are currently helping us fund our mortgages. So we're able to lend and support first-time buyers now. We also know that with every housing transaction, there are other associated costs, and that's putting money back into the economy. So, the broader argument as this is a good product in my perspective.
It's Fairweather.
Yeah, I'd just like to make the point. I mean, there are specific incentives with the LISA for specific reasons, and which you don't access with, say, a stocks and shares ISA. So I think it comes back from a policy perspective. Do you want to incentivise first-time buyers to buy their first home? As Charlotte was saying, there are a huge number of reasons why that's a good policy outcome. And then secondly, it offers an alternative way of incentivising saving for pensions, which is especially important if you don't receive any employer contribution, if you're self-employed in particular. So I think it's a narrow product, it's an unusual combination, but actually what are we talking about? We're talking about you're putting your money away for a long-term decision, and actually I think, in common with other people with these customers, I think we see people who, once they have bought their home, they're keeping that account open and they could seek to save in it later on, particularly once, maybe their children have grown up, they've done up their house, they're feeling a bit more comfortable again, maybe in their 50s they might put more money into it again. So it's still quite early days to see how that product will be used in later life.
Put money in after 40, can they?
If you've opened it before, you can put it in after, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Mr. Dean.
Just a couple of data points, and I don't expect you to be able to answer them now, but it'd be good to know if you would have that data and could supply it to us afterwards. Mr. Medge, you mentioned about 80% of your users are incomes £40,000 and lower, which is really interesting to the distributional impact of this product. Will the others have that kind of data too? Would you be able to tell us what kind of proportion of your users, what kind of income level they're at, and what the average property price is of your users? If you could supply that to the committee afterwards, I think that'd be really useful.
Mr. Jim, we cited a research report in our evidence. It's slightly old, but from the Resolution Foundation, which talks about 47% of the wealth that's held was held by people in the top quintile, so the top 20% of household incomes. But that's the source for that is in our evidence.
The second data point I would like to ask for, if you've got it, is just how many people continue to pay into their LISA products after completing their house purchase. And I appreciate it's early days for some, but we should have some years of data, some indication whether people are putting anything at all, or whether, as you might have overheard in the last year, they've abandoned them a little bit like I have. So if you've got any data on what proportion of LISA holders after property purchase continue to make investments in, that would be really useful.
31% have some Moneybox product open with a positive balance 3 months after house purchase. And the reason why different Moneybox products are important in that is that the first thing that you do when you purchase a home is build back up your emergency fund. So they will be using different types of savings accounts and not just specifically the lifetime ISA in the 3 to 6 months after.
Just to clarify though, because I have a positive balance in my LISA, but that's just because what was left over from after paying down the deposit. So payments
again.
Sorry, 70p. That has grown, I think, since as well. I think it was slightly lower, so that is. No, I mean, I think it was about 60p before. But anyway, but I mean, making active investments after the point of purchase. I don't know.
So thank you. So for Skipton customers, we have seen 50% have chosen to leave their lifetime ISA open, and 5% have deposited into that product since.
5%, okay.
Mr. Stone?
The comment I was going to make was I think this goes back to my answer earlier about the complexity of the product and its two purposes and the different types of investment you would want to make for the two purposes. Because part of the issue here is when you open it originally and when you look at the number of providers there are in the market, there's a preponderance towards cash LISAs, because actually if it's the first time buyer, that's what you want to invest in because you don't want to risk the capital value of your deposit for your home. If you've then still got that open as a cash LISA and accepting that, Ms. Fairweather was saying that Hargreaves Lansdowns is an investment LISA and there are investment LISAs out there. I used to run a retail platform called the Share Centre and we were one of the first LISA providers of a stocks and shares LISA back in 2017. But if you're in a cash LISA, you don't then really want to, or you shouldn't really be putting more money into that as a cash product if you're then using it for saving for retirement, which may be 30 or 40 years hence. So again, this is part of the problem, is that the principal demand at the moment for the product is coming from first-time buyers or people who want to use it to buy their first home. They want to do that in a cash product, so that's where the majority of the supply comes from. But then to carry on using that for retirement isn't the right vehicle or the right product, so you end up with that.
Do you think there should be a switching mechanism between cash and equities, and is that possible? Easily regulated?
Well, I mean, in a stocks and shares ISA at the moment, there's nothing to stop you keeping cash in a stocks and shares ISA. I mean, you don't have to have, I mean, I think you could have a mixture of both within, but or you could have a cash ISA and a stocks and shares ISA.
Can I just come in, because that is the question I was going to ask, but I just want to probe a bit further. So surely the huge success for younger people to get on the property ladder using this product, that, I mean, you're all passionate about that, that's brilliant. Surely once they've got their foot in the door into savings, we want to keep them at a rate higher than the 5% reuse rate that Ms Harrison stated. Is there a model where you could keep the same account, but once you've taken out your first time buyer deposit from the savings cash ISA, it switches to an investment ISA for the long term? Like in that, but it's the same account. I'm just thinking about simplicity and actually how people use these products. Or is that very complicated? Mr. Byrnes?
So there will be a mechanism, and that's where the advice guidance boundary review is incredibly important in all of this conversation, where we can provide better support to people to move to investing over time. It will never be appropriate for every single person to move from cash to stocks and shares investing, despite them saving for retirement over the longer term. There will still be people that simply do not have the risk appetite to weather the market ups and downs, despite the fact that we think that that is the best thing for them to do. So we need to provide them with the support, and I keep referencing the advice guidance boundary review, but it is going to be absolutely fundamental here. So there's more to do there, but I would not advocate for an automatic switch over to stocks and shares.
I'd just like to add to that. I mean, I think what's important here is having a long-term product set. So people who've put money into a LISA today are expecting it to be there for the next 10 years longer, potentially. So I think the first thing is to bear in mind with the product set that essentially the government is offering through LISAs, etc., keeping that product set stable is quite an important part of building confidence. So I think that's the first thing to consider. The second is then how do we evolve that product set around our client needs? So clearly when LISAs were first opened, you had people between the ages of 18 and 39, and by and large they were saving for their first home. Obviously, a number of them have done that through investment with HL. I think it's worth saying that some people might be saving for a considerable amount of time for their first home, and so longer term investment might be the right route for them. But I think getting that balance right between cash and long term investment is the most difficult financial decision that people need to make. And precisely to Mr. Byrnes's point, that's where this advice guidance boundary review is so important for us as a company, but also I think for us all societally, because that will enable us to be able to say, people with your kind of income in your kind of circumstances, this is sort of the right amount of cash savings you should have. This is the point where you should be investing for the longer term. And being able to take that complexity away for the client so they don't even necessarily have to wonder about which product do I need to open. We can have the conversation with the client around, here's the right balance between cash and investment for you, for what you want to achieve. Now we understand your investment time horizon, etc. And then almost behind the scenes, we would be able to then guide them towards what's the most tax efficient product for them to do that in. So I think at the moment we're in a sort of catch-22 where we're having to provide quite generic information to all people all of the time, and so that doesn't necessarily help people make those choices. We're going to be moving into a world hopefully next year with targeted support where we'll be able to help people more in that.
Thank you. I just wanted to check on the record, Ms. Fairweather. You just said earlier, we were both a little bit confused. You said you can contribute up to £4,000 a year. You can contribute to a LISA forever up to any age, or I think you said you can keep contributing
to 55. Yeah.
Yeah, but you can only put in up to £4,000 a year until you're 50. But you must open it before you're 40, just to be clear. So we're clear about that on the record. Yeah. Just in case anyone listening gets confusing. So you're putting £4,000 a year up to the age of 50, but you must open it before you're 40. Okay, and then you can't access it till you're 60 at that point. Okay, Dame Harriet Baldwin MP.
Thank you, Chair. In your written evidence, all of you say that you've got an issue with the withdrawal penalty. And I wanted to ask you if any of you've got any evidence that the withdrawal penalty itself is preventing people from opening a LISA.
We have some survey data that we can share with the committee afterwards that suggests that people are using potentially less appropriate products for saving for their first home because of both the withdrawal penalty and the house price cap. The objective of the withdrawal penalty and all government savings policy should be to encourage people to save more in the most appropriate product that they can. And the withdrawal penalty, our evidence suggests that it is putting people off from doing that. And we can make it more equitable, simpler, and make sure that people don't lose any of their own funds. Such was the case during the pandemic, where we did not see a significant spike in withdrawals.
Do you all agree with that? Have any of you got any additional evidence you want to share with the committee?
I just reflect that when you're trying to encourage people to make financial decisions for the longer term, removing friction from those choices is quite important. So the fact that we have to be upfront about the withdrawal penalty and have to explain that through with the consumer, that automatically would create more drop-off in that journey. So we'd be most interested in smoothing that journey.
And we've had evidence that the penalty should be moved to 20% as it was during the pandemic on a permanent basis. Do any of you want to make a different case for the penalty? No? Anyone want to disagree with the evidence that we've heard about the home buying price? If you end up just spending a bit more than $450,000, but it is your first home, you shouldn't have to pay the penalty there. Does anyone want to disagree with that evidence we've received?
I would disagree slightly just with the mechanism. They are obviously incredibly linked to the house price cap and with the withdrawal penalty. Our evidence suggests that the house price cap today impacts about 1% of active lifetime ISA savers. It's very hard to prove a negative of who is not taking out the lifetime ISA because of the house price cap. We must separate the house price cap mechanism versus the value of a house that can be bought for £450,000. The value of a house that can be bought for £450,000 across most of the country is a very, very nice house. But when we speak to our customers and we say, how long are you planning to save for? A not insubstantial amount say they're going to be saving for 7 to 10 years, if not more, even using the lifetime ISA. What we have to do is have a mechanism that they can buy the same value of house going forwards in 10 years' time as they can do today. And that's why we recommended an annual review of the house price cap in line with house price inflation. We think that is the most sensible way forward, and that should move in line also with the withdrawal penalty being reduced from 25 to 20%.
Ms. Harrison? Yes, Ms. Harrison, it's just worth highlighting to anyone that Skipton Building Society have helpfully provided some late evidence which we agreed to publish this morning,
Yes.
highlighting some of these very points. Ms. Harrison,
Yes.
actually could speak to that.
So I was just going to come to the point around the maximum price cap. And our data shows that when the LISA was first launched back in 2017, in England, the average first-time buyer property price that would have exceeded that price cap at 450 at that point in time was around 4.2% of local authorities. Our forecast is that in 2 years' time that triples to 12 in England. So I do think that there is a recommended review now of the price cap, and that, to your point, that is therefore then index linked, so to give surety that if I'm committing in cash or investments today, that I will still be able to purchase something. I had a customer, in fact, emailed me directly on this subject yesterday, which was, I've opened a lifetime ISA in 2020. For the first 2 tax years, I saved the full contribution. I can, and now I'm living in London, I'm 32, I haven't contributed anything for the past 3 years because I'm trapped out of that with my current purchase price. So I think it does
and I know we've got more questions on that, but in last year, the evidence we've had is that nearly 100,000 people paid the withdrawal penalty, and only 56,000 people actually used their LISA to buy a new home. That's got to mean that there's a problem with the design here, doesn't it, Ms. Fairweather?
I mean, you'd have to sort of go into that in more detail, certainly, but I think the question from my mind from a policy perspective is, what is the purpose of the withdrawal penalty? So this is obviously about making sure that people are putting that money away and getting that incentive from the government for house purchase or for retirement. I think that's fine as in conception. I think there's a question of whether you do need that extra penalty, and I think especially in the case of where you're buying a home that's more expensive, I think that's probably one of the more egregious cases of where it's being used. So you could potentially look at other ways in which you want to balance that. But certainly, I think from our perspective, the 2 major use cases here for the self-employed who may need to withdraw money in extremis, to then penalise them when they've been trying to put money away from the longer term, especially when that group is really under saving for retirement, I would suggest it doesn't necessarily help your policy aim there. So I think we'd be very keen on looking at that use case in particular with regard to the penalty. And then secondly, certainly with those more expensive house purchases, you know, not gaining any incentive above that, totally fine, but, you know, to disincentivise being able to buy at that level seems odd, especially, as everybody has said, when people started out saving in their LISA, they didn't know where house prices were going to go over the decade. They might have started out saving as a single person and then bought as a couple, and they may have moved areas for jobs, etc. So to this point, when we're trying to encourage people to save and invest for the longer term, let's make it as easy as possible, because actually it's very hard to predict where you're going to be in 10 years' time.
And very quickly, Mr. Stone.
Yeah, I think the debate in itself, and as I said, we're not a provider, the debate in itself highlights the complexity and the things that you have to explain to people when they're taking out the product. I think the fact that, as you highlighted, more people were penalised than used the product to buy a first home is potentially problematic in you know, whether the product is achieving its aims. And you have to take a step back and say, well, there may be other ways of achieving those aims with the same objective. Just because the product isn't working and could be reformed doesn't actually necessarily mean the policy outcome should be to retain that product. There may be a better way of doing it as a whole.
Thank you very much, Dame Harriet. You and the young MP.
I want to go back to this point, Ms. Stone, that you made about cash ISAs and driving an investment culture. I think various panellists made it. And there is also an issue about risk aversion of customers who, particularly low-income customers, and in particular we see women taking up many more cash ISAs than men, opting for that for a particular reason. I mean, there is a reason behind that risk-averse behaviour. So I was wondering if members of the panel might want to comment on, in this proposed transition to an investment based culture, how you would get risk averse investors to see that as a real option.
Yeah, I mean, I think this touches on a range of other issues. I mean, there's a whole issue around financial literacy, around risk appetite, and in our evidence, we suggested that the committee might want to look at the ISA regime as a whole beyond just the LISA and look at the innovative finance ISA, the cash ISA, and how they sit together. The FCA in its consumer investment strategy has said that there's too much long-term saving and investment kept in cash, and they want to do more to encourage people with pots of cash over £10,000 to expose those to the market and invest them, because that's one of the reasons why, from a productive finance perspective, which we heard about in the first panel, from a long-term returns and savings perspective, we're not earning the returns that we should be. There are lots of other incentives to saving cash already. You have the personal savings allowance of £1,000 a year of interest income for the basic rate taxpayer. For example, I mean, that would enable somebody to save about £22,500 in cash without paying any tax on the interest today, which is relatively high against the median income. So there's lots of things we can do, but there's a big financial education piece, frankly, around investment and that cultural point.
And I'm hearing you, Mr. Stone, talking about changing the incentives as opposed to getting rid of cash ISAs and funneling people through compulsion.
Absolutely. I mean, cash, just to be very clear, although we would recommend, and we recommend in our evidence to the committee, that actually the cash ISA should either be scrapped or the limit severely restricted back down to about £5,000. That would enable a building of a cash pot way above the FCA's £10,000 that I was talking about just a minute ago. Cash does form a fundamental part of financial resilience. It is where people should start their savings, and it's right that the government should incentivise an element of cash saving to get people on that journey.
But given that behaviour takes a long time to change, and there are reasons why low-income people are more risk-averse, if you were to do that scrapping, as you suggest, or limiting at 5,000, do you think that is there any modelling of behaviour that you'd expect? I see Mr. Byrnes shaking his head that people will actually change that into an investment product.
I think you could just have a much clearer conversation with the consumer about how and where they could save in cash and be and get their tax-free interest income on that as a starting pot. How they can then save from an investment perspective in an investment ISA, and where their pension long-term savings sits. I think you just need a much clearer landscape for people to help that education.
I know Ms. Fairweather's been waiting, and then Mr. Byrnes after that. Yeah.
I should just say, just to interrupt for a moment, we are expecting votes in the next possibly 20 minutes. So if we can keep answers tight, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Ms. Fairweather.
I'd say one of the advantages of the current system is simplicity. So people could move their money from a cash ISA into a stocks and shares ISA today. So the big question is, why aren't they? And it's not the wrapper that's the barrier here. It's confidence, it's understanding when is the right time to take risk. And luckily there's been quite a large amount of research on this with consumers. So one of our trade associations, TISA, has done a lot of work on this as we were working with them on making the case for this advice guidance boundary review, because we recognise particularly enabling help, 39% of people didn't think financial advice would be for them. It's the cost of financial advice in particular. So I think there's a number of things that we can do already as firms to make it easier. One is removing jargon. Absolutely, that came up in the research as a big problem. The second one is around contextualising risk warnings, and there's some quite recent research on this which ties us supported with the University of Nottingham, where it shows that rather than just saying your money's at risk with investment, if you put that in some context, for example, over a 5-year period, you're more likely to see returns from investment. And we've actually managed to change those risk warnings within the current rules, and we're already seeing an uplift in the number of people opening a stocks and shares ISA as a result. So this is about democratising understanding of when is the right time to invest. And I think being able to do things like slim down options for people, understand what is the balance between cash and investment for them, all of that will come forward with this targeted support regime. So there's things we can do now, there's a lot more that we can do in the future in order to shift this behaviour. But let's be clear, this is about behaviour shift and changing that culture rather than the wrappers.
So Moneybox has both cash and stocks and shares products, so I think hopefully we're quite balanced in this debate. I have been advising customers and educating customers for the last 15 years between the balance of saving in cash versus investing. I would love nothing more if there was a simple button that we could press with the allowances that would suddenly make more people comfortable and confident investors. There isn't. The reason that people don't invest in the UK, they are complex and they are individual to people's kind of different circumstances. They must be addressed via a thoughtful, joined-up piece of work, and thankfully there is a piece of work going on, the Advice Guidance Boundary Review. To bring that to life, 12 providers were over at the FCA yesterday. We are going to be working with them over the next 6 weeks, building prototypes of targeted support, which will make people more confident, hopefully, if the prototypes go well, moving from cash to investing. That is going to be far, far more powerful than making short-term decisions on the most popular financial product in the UK, being the cash ISA.
It's probably worth highlighting the FCA has more research coming out on precisely this point in the coming months.
Do I hear both Mr. Byrnes and Ms. Fairweather as saying keep cash ISAs on their level until that work has been done? Is that what you're saying?
Because I think the other thing is if you reduce the amount of money you can hold in your cash ISA in future, then the conversation we'll be having with clients next year will be, if you will have that money put away for the longer term, investment is probably going to get you better returns. However, if it's wrapped in that ISA and at some point you want to put it back, you may not be able to. It just complicates that conversation considerably. And actually, you might end up with those cash ISA pots being locked into cash rather than being moved across to investment.
Thank you very much. Rachel Blake MP.
Thank you, Chair. I think you're united in thinking that the price cap has to go up. And Ms. Harrison, you talked about the barrier for London in particular of people being able to purchase a home. But there is also the value for money argument for the government to think about the scale of investment that they should make in particular regions and in particular markets. Have you put much thought into what kind of cap there could be in different regions?
Yes, and I don't necessarily think going back to creating additional complexity, people may be saving in certain areas, having to move. So actually, rather than having huge regional skews, I'd advocate for a blanket move on the price cap. Our recommendation was that needs to be to a minimum of £500,000. So we're not talking about significant sways upward. Our affordability index forecast also showed that a move to 550,000 would keep the average first-time buyer, if I say exclusions as was in 2017, so 4.2% in England, sat outside of that. If you were to maintain 550,000, you'd be maintaining that position. So when we're talking about value, it's not a significant move up, but I think what we should be doing is index linking that so that people have certainty that when they are then investing and putting cash into that vehicle, that they can utilise that for what the intended purpose is.
Thank you very much.
I think Lily McAvoy wanted to come in on this point, was it? Very briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. Just wanted, Ms Harrison, if you could give us a bit more detail on the actual percentage of deposits that you think people who are using this ISA are actually taking out. Are they doing... Sorry, I'll rephrase that. Are we talking about 5% mortgages or 10% mortgages when we're looking at the products that your customers are using mostly?
Deposits, you mean 5%?
Deposits, I do mean deposits.
So I can find out and come back with probably more specific data around lifetime ISA. That would
be very helpful.
Yeah. The average first-time buyer deposit in the UK is typically 25 to 30%, and that is because house prices warrant that in order to have the affordability stretch, you need that. That comes through products such as income boosters, Bank of Mum and Dad, etc. So this is, I suppose, back to my point that enabling home ownership and the challenges that people face, especially so stark at getting onto the property ladder, there isn't really a silver bullet, which is why we want a range of measures that help people.
I suppose I'm just slightly concerned about raising it to £500,000, right, for a first-time home. The deposit required for that for a couple is huge, and you know, I'm not giving financial advice, but on a 5%, even on a 5% deposit, like, I don't know if that's...
The average first-time buyer deposit is around £50,000-60,000. In kind of London South East, that can be up to 150,000. So people are stretched significantly.
What's the average first-time deposit in the UK as a whole, rather than London South East?
60,000.
I think it sounds like you've got a lot of data from Skipton, and the data you've already provided is really useful. So any data any of you can provide would be very, very helpful. And we think the panic's slightly off on votes. We were misreading the enunciator. Mr. Bobby Dean, MP.
Yeah, there's obviously quite a lot of variables in this conversation, so I want to try and hold a couple of them if I can. So let's assume that the withdrawal penalty is changed in the way that most of you have proposed, so there is no effective fine on top of the bonus element afterwards. And let's also assume that some sort of inflation index is introduced, so that people have certainty over a 10-year period that the value of the home they're saving for won't outpace them. With those two things in mind, what do you think a fair price cap should be? Because going back to Ms Blake's point before, I feel like it shouldn't be unlimited because of the costs to the taxpayer. The average price of a home is currently 270 grand. We've got the cap currently at 450,000. So accepting that it may need to move over time going forward, and that the withdrawal penalty element may be gone, could the cap even come down and still benefit an awful lot of people?
I think it's a question of how it interacts with that penalty.
So can we assume that the penalty is down to 20%, or the withdrawal rate is charged now down to 20%, just for the sake of argument? So we will have an index link, we will have the withdrawal charge at 20%. Could that cap still come down and support? I think you said, Mr Byrnes, that most people are not going anywhere near this cap anyway in terms of your users.
Yeah, and I think the pressure on the public finances and the value for money point is one of the reasons that we're not advocating that the price cap should jump up significantly today, and that it should just be reviewed on an annual basis from £450,000 going upwards. The reason I would say going upwards is the movement in property prices over the last 8 years. So house prices have increased by 30% since the Lifetime ISA has been introduced. We also run what's called Lifetime ISA hotspot data, and the top 3 cities most popular for Lifetime ISA over the course of 2024 was Bristol, Manchester and Belfast. So Manchester in particular and Bristol, these are areas of the country outside London and the South East where the average house prices are rapidly coming up towards the house price cap. So for those reasons, I would suggest that bringing the house price cap down probably wouldn't be the right thing to do for Lifetime ISA customers, in order for them to have certainty going forwards that it'll be fit for purpose for those that are going to be saving for 7 to 10 years from here.
And the only point I go back to as well is we know that it's taking longer to save to get onto the property ladder, to get that first foot onto the property ladder. And I think we heard the panel before talking about what does that first time buyer house look like. And so how can we ensure that if people are buying as families, as blended families, that we can cater for that? So that's why I'd advocate that you wouldn't reduce that property price.
And can I just ask you a follow-up question? Because you said before about, because this is mainly a regional problem as well, right? London and South East are the reason why there's so much upward pressure on the cap. Yeah. But you've said to me that it's too complex to do that. I mean, we've had previous products like Help to Buy where there was quite a clear regional difference. Why shouldn't we just have a regional cap that's higher for London and South East?
So I think for London and South East you could. I think if you wanted to then introduce multiple regional caps across the country, that would add additional complexity. And going back to the point of people are saving and if they're having to move into different areas, it adds additional challenge. And going back to the, do I understand what I'm purchasing? Do I understand the complexities that are involved with this product? What does that mean for me? You'd want to be absolutely crystal clear on that. Could you have something for London and South East? Yes, you could.
I'd just like to say, as a company that employs over 2,000 people in Bristol, it's not just the London and South East problem.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the what we see in the data, which is in 2017 at original launch, it was absolutely that. But we are seeing a shift and we're seeing that change.
Thank you very much. Mr John Grady, MP.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg. Just to set out the landscape a little bit so we're all on the same page, because this can get quite complicated. If I have a SIP, I get tax relief from the way in at my marginal rate of tax. If I have a LISA, I get a bonus, although obviously it's a withdrawal penalty. If I put in an ISA, there's no additional tax benefits on the way in. And if I have a DC scheme, I get employer contributions as well. Then on the way out, if I have a SIP, I've got income tax. If I've got a LISA, it's tax-free. If I've got an ISA, it's tax-free, the income, and the pension pension, if it's converted into an annuity or otherwise, I get income tax on that. It's probably best to avoid inheritance tax today, and obviously whilst it's within the wrapper, you've got capital gains tax. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I'll get into trouble in a minute, of course, is we've got different tax rates in England and Scotland. So in Scotland, we pay more tax. I'll not comment on the state of the public services and the relationship to that. A proper place you have for it. And then the third thing is we've got different retirement ages. So you can take your SIP from, 55 and 57. Your state pension retirement age is up to 67 or whatever it is. For LISA, it's 60. And then you've got different savings limits as well. So with all that in mind, you're all in the financial services industries. Who should choose a LISA to save for retirement? Is there a kind of benchmark person who should choose a LISA as opposed to another product?
And Fairweather, we're willing to step up.
I don't know who I should start with.
A lot of those saving for a first home, it's clearly for additional retirement saving out over and above your workplace pension. If you're a basic rate taxpayer, it can be a better option. And then secondly, if you're self-employed without that employer contribution and you're a basic rate taxpayer, it's absolutely a better option.
Would anyone demur from what Ms Fairweather said?
No, I think there are some brilliant examples. Reading between the lines, I completely understand the concern that lots of people may be giving up higher rate tax relief, for example, by contributing to a lifetime ISA rather than a SIP. But the income demographics that I shared earlier of Moneybox lifetime ISA customers suggest that that is not happening en masse. There are several use cases which Ms Fairweather has articulated there, where the lifetime ISA is a very good option for lifetime ISA savings. And as I mentioned at the start, with so many millions of people under saving for retirement, we should not be removing a perfectly valid and valuable option from the retirement landscape for them. What we should be doing is providing them with a lot more support to make an educated decision for them, which is, keep going back to the advice, guidance, boundary review, these things are incredibly linked. So yes, we should be aiming for simplicity, we should be aiming for support on top of that, and giving people as many options as they need to make the retirement savings that we desperately need them to.
I'm very mindful that time's marching on and we may have votes, so am I taking it with a basic position here is that the position of each of you on the panel is broadly that it's good for basic rate taxpayers who aren't in employer schemes and not good for many other people really, unless it's a supplement to what they've already got.
But also it's always good to open a LISA if you're under the age of 40 because you have that optionality later on.
I think the one point that I would make is back to where I kind of started from in terms of the complexity within the system as a whole, which I think your examples highlight. And there's a fundamental principle that we've operated on historically, which is pensions are effectively tax-free on the way in. You get the tax relief on the way in and you're taxed on the way out. That's how pension saving works. And ISAs and other savings, it's taxed income, but you then don't pay tax on the way out. And in both cases, you don't pay tax on the gains and things on the in-between. But the LISA muddies that effectively with the bonus and everything else. So.
Mr. Byrnes, do you have
one very quick point that
yes.
we haven't touched on is the access of the lifetime ISA versus a pension.
Yes.
Even with the withdrawal penalty as it is today, you have far more access to a lifetime ISA than you do for a pension. You cannot get your hands on pension money before 55 or 57. With the lifetime ISA, if a true emergency occurs, you can pay the 6.25%. Hopefully you wouldn't have to pay in the future. You could just pay back the government bonus and pay your medical emergency or whatever it might be. So that access point is another kind of tick in the box of lifetime ISA. It just gives you that additional bit of optionality.
That's a very interesting point, Mr. Byrnes. I suppose the question I would ask for the rest of the panel is, do they agree? Because are we confusing two things? The, if you like, rainy day fund you need for medical emergencies and all the rest of it, and long-term pension saving? And does, in fact, that easier access for pension saving point away from this being a good pension saving product?
I think that's the point for the self-employed, is precisely they're afraid to tie up that money. They tend to hoard cash, and certainly the research from our Savings and Resilience Barometer really shows that. When, at least if they put that money into a LISA, one, behaviourally, most people, once they've put money away for the longer term, it's the last pot they're going to touch. And then secondly, it does mean in extremis, if something goes wrong with their self-employment, they are able to access that money. But at the moment, they'd be subject to that penalty. So I think it's about, do we want to make sure that group is rewarded for saving for the longer term for retirement? I would argue, yes, they do need more incentives in the system in order to boost those retirement savings. And so I think that's where the flexibility within the LISA is actually very helpful for that group in particular. But we would need to address the age cap within the LISA, because the majority of self-employed people are over the age of 40, and so wouldn't necessarily be able to access the LISA as a savings
interesting
product
point, Mrs. Fairweather. I suspect it'd need a whole new inquiry on saving for self-employed people, actually, but it is a really interesting point. Further question then, obviously the Hargreaves Lansdown evidence is that 47.3% of outright homeowners are on track for a moderate retirement income. It's a bit late for complex maths, so that means over 50% are not on track for a moderate retirement income. That's very worrying. And when it comes to renters, just 15.5%. And the LISA retirement cap contributions is what, £4,000 a year or whatever it is. I mean, that's nowhere near enough for people to save. Is that another aspect of which points to a flaw in the product for retirement saving?
Well, it'd be 4,000 plus the bonus, so 5,000 a year. So I'd have to come back with the maths on precisely where that.
Well, you bought a home
you.
and you spent most of it for that, and then you start saving again.
The reality is we're not saving enough for our retirement. I mean, I think Mr. Glenn said earlier about the contribution rates getting up towards Australian levels, for example. We're still behind other countries in the world in terms of contribution levels as well as returns. When we then actually do have those pots of savings, the returns we earn because of the way we're investing the money. So no, it's not enough, and the auto enrolment scheme at the moment is not enough. We need to increase those rates, and we need to increase the amount we're saving for retirement.
Probably final question from me, because time's marching on.
Marched.
It has well and truly marched today, hasn't it? Does this discussion illustrate the fundamental problem here, that it's all just too complicated for people to save in this country?
I think I've already said yes, I would, and hence I would scrap it and simplify the landscape and try and encourage better engagement through clearer messaging.
Fairweather?
I mean, I would also say people's lives are complicated, right? People move in and out of self-employment into employment, back out again. People's families change over time. So I think trying to find a simple route through is always nice in conception, but actually we think the LISA brings some flexibility in precisely for people in slightly different circumstances. So I think that would be my one watch out in that. I think what we need to do is make it clearer for people to make the right choices for them, and actually the most complicated choice is that choice between cash and long-term investment and pensions, and getting that balance right. Absolutely, this advice guidance boundary change will help us with that.
Mrs. Harrison?
I think it should be on us to make sure that we remove the complexity rather than remove product choice.
Thank you very much. Mr. Byrnes, briefly.
I think what we're asking for is actually quite simple in terms of getting more people to benefit from the lifetime ISA going forward. So the withdrawal penalty and the house price cap solutions that we've talked about, it is just natural that those area of the rules will get more airtime than the 1.5 million people just quietly saving away and getting into very good saving and investing habits. So I would say that we have provided a large volume of evidence to the committee that shows that brilliant things are happening within the lifetime ISA. Lots of people not thinking it's overly complex, lots of people buying houses, saving for retirement, getting into really good financial habits, and we can accentuate that going forwards with some very simple tweaks to the product rules.
Thank you very much. Mr. John Glenn.
Yeah, if we assume that the caps and the penalties are sorted out, well, I think we've seen substantial evidence that as a saving vehicle for somebody wanting a deposit to buy their first home is proved to be a success. Just want to probe and get some clarity over what happens afterwards, because Mr. Byrnes, you've said that I think 79% of people aspire to continue.
On the survey of 3,100 people.
But if we take that as reasonable,
weighted sample, I'm assuming.
But given my colleague Mr. Grady set out all the advantages and options in terms of pension saving, but particularly for people with the sort of tax advantage for higher rate taxpayers, but also the way that the auto-enrolment has moved forward. And given the reality is that once you've started, when you bought property, you know, probably if you've got a 90% or 95% mortgage, a lot of your disposable income's going on, you know, just paying your mortgage and living. It's unrealistic, really, and you haven't really got enough data, have you? Because that's an aspiration, that's not a reality. And what I'm trying to get at is if you've opened a cash LISA, right, subsequently it's clear that you need to put it into equities to make it worthwhile if you've bought it before you're 40, because you're not going to use it for anything other than 20 years hence plus when you're in pension. Is there a mechanism at the moment to switch what started as a cash ISA to an equities LISA to an equities LISA after you've taken the money out for the deposit?
So I think you're right in saying that the data doesn't exist yet because it is very early in a lifetime product. The first person can't withdraw from this for
I'm not criticising you, I'm just saying.
Until 2037. The fact that 79% of people, even answering a survey, will say, I am thinking of making supplementary retirement savings in the future is absolutely incredible. The reason that they're doing that is because they have had a fantastic experience with the lifetime ISA so far, and it has been their primary financial goal.
I understand that, but the specific point is that's a cash-based product. What I'm saying is that if you're then going to switch to use it for savings for pensions or as a complement to pension, your auto-enrolled pension, can you switch from the cash-based thing to a equities-based savings vehicle, i.e. the same one? I mean, can you retain the benefits from opening it earlier?
Yes, and that's why people are keen to return to it. So you can switch over to the stocks and shares version. Now, we need to do a lot more financial education and targeted support from the Advice Guidance Boundary Review to make sure that more people are comfortable using the stocks and shares version for retirement. But as it stands today, even without the financial education landscape as it is today, more people use the stocks and shares version for retirement than do for the house buying, which is what you would expect. But I would agree with you that more can be done there.
What I'm just trying to get at is that if you want to fulfil that aspiration of those 79%, surely you must feel a responsibility for them to move over with all that, notwithstanding the issues around advice, to get into the equities. Otherwise, it's not going to be actually the right product, probably, is it?
It is hard to say.
For a 40-year-old to have cash as only for a savings product for retirement is probably not the right thing, is it?
It is hard to say, notwithstanding the issues around advice, because that is what precludes us from being very hands-on with these customers. This is why from day one we have engaged with the Advice Guidance Boundary Review, and we are excited about what that brings.
If we can fix that, we then get a viable transition, and the dual purpose that Mr. Johnson from the first panel envisaged for this could be achieved.
That is the number one example I've given to the FCA for targeted support, is switching people from cash to stocks and shares lifetime ISA for retirement. It is a perfect use case for that.
And you've got a point in time in which they buy their first property for most cases.
Exactly, and you have the date in the future when they can access it as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Lola McAvoy.
Thank you, Dame Meg. Just another one on deposit. Sorry to bring us back to this late in the day. On the deposits, from those of you who have customers using these products, how many people are using their savings in the LISA for 100% of their deposit?
I can share that data.
I think is it just
no?
Okay,
people are adding to.
Now, are they adding? Just so that I can understand, is it a small part of the deposit, and the majority is coming from the bank of mum and dad, or is it the majority part of the deposit and a small part is coming from an auntie or something?
Ms. Harrison, anything you can share on that?
So I will say, can I follow up with some statistics? Because I can follow up on that. We do see people saving in their lifetime ISA and also doing regular savings alongside. And I also know that we also see some supplemental support as well. But I'll have to follow. I don't have the data to hand.
Thank
you.
So the average property price that we see of people using lifetime ISA is around about £270,000. The average withdrawal from a lifetime ISA from HMRC data is around about £12,000, which would suggest people are getting about a £3,000 government bonus on average. So it represents a small but absolutely not insignificant helping hand towards that deposit and the saving and investing habits that it gets them into for life.
Right.
But to answer the question, if the average deposit is £60,000, I think you said, Ms. Harrison.
In the UK.
In the UK, and the average withdrawal from the ISA is 12,000, then you can see where the disconnect comes.
I think Zoopla says that it's 34,000 the average UK deposit. But we can pick up the data after, so.
Even if it was 34 and 12,
even so,
still
I'm just interested as to whether it's the majority chunk. I'm just thinking about low...
Maybe deposits of first-time buyers versus
people without
deposits,
the bank of mum and dad, basically. Is this working for them?
There's a lot of data that we will need to collect, and I thank you very much indeed for that. Before we do move on, though, and close the session, I mentioned in the first panel about the cash ISA, obviously speculation rife on this, and as I say, this committee and none of us, or any of us individually or together, have any insight on that, but I would be interested to hear your views, if you've got them, about what you think about the cash ISA limit and what you think, would there be any benefits or disbenefits to changing the £20,000 cash ISA limit. Mr. Stone?
As I said earlier, I would start by saying that having cash savings as your rainy day pot is absolutely essential, and that's where anybody should start their sort of savings journey, and it's right in terms of encouraging financial resilience that the government incentivises that in some way. But I think to continue to incentivise further and further cash savings, I think you've got to question the value to the taxpayer of that benefit when you're giving an incentive on cash in that way. And £20,000 a year, we would argue, is too much. I think you could either scrap the cash ISA, given that there is plenty of incentive within the tax system to already save more than £20,000 and receive all the interest income, etc., tax-free, or at the very least, as we say in our evidence to the committee, reduce the annual contribution down to £5,000. And to be clear, I think you said in the first panel, we're not talking about any threat to people's existing cash ISA pots.
So just pick up on that, because if you, obviously, if you're a lower rate taxpayer, you get £1,000 interest tax-free. Yep. If you're a high rate taxpayer, £500. If you're an additional rate, nothing.
Nothing.
So if you had £20,000 in a savings account and you were, instead of a cash ISA, so let's say you were someone maxing out even between £10,000 in a year, which would be a significant amount for most people, you could very quickly trigger that £1,000 threshold or £500,000 threshold. So you would actually begin to wipe out the benefit of the savings. And you're saying that that would be something you'd be...
But I think the question is, you go back to I go back to the FCA's consumer investment strategy, which says that, they want to encourage people with more than £10,000 saved in cash to expose that to the market so that there's a benefit to the economy and to
I think people would really just jump from one to the other. If you're saving, for instance, for your children to go to university, a fixed point where they might do that, or you're saving for some other lifetime event.
Just because there isn't a tax incentive there to save in cash won't necessarily stop people from saving in cash, but should the state be incentivising people to save that additional amount in cash, I think is where the question comes.
Do you think there's a period of time where there should be a transition? If for example, we're not expecting, as we speak, we don't know, a fiscal event on the 26th of March, could be a possibility, it could be something the Chancellor says we have no idea. But if there were a point where the Chancellor would say, I'm going to look at this, what would be an optimal time for making a transition from the 20,000? Do you think it should be instant, consulted on, produced over a period of time? What would be your...
I think ideally probably consulted on, but then if not consulted on and there's a point in time, then I think it's right to give people sufficient notice of that so they can build that into their planning. So if it was March, you might want to do it not from that 5th of April, but the following 5th of April or something, so that a year or so that you give people notice. But I would have anticipated a change of that nature probably to warrant some form of consultation. But I think it's just... it's the whole productive finance debate. It's how we encourage more investment in infrastructure, etc. The public purse, we know the state of the public purse. It cannot do all of the heavy lifting in terms of the investment that this country needs, and there's an awful lot of money invested or saved in and being saved into cash and being incentivised to save into cash, which isn't then driving and helping drive that economic growth agenda. And
you're also saying some people might put that into savings accounts, not into an investment, so it might not produce the results you suggest. But Ms Harrison, on the same point, so I won't repeat the questions.
And I would strongly urge that we do not reduce the limit. I don't believe that it would have the intended outcome, which is that we would switch that into investments and therefore support the growth agenda that's been cited. Research that the Building Society Association has conducted says consumer research, 73% have advocated against this. We also know that the cash ISAs and ISAs provide a really important funding vehicle for banks and building societies. So building societies specifically.
Could you just explain that? Because I think we know what you mean, but could you just explain that in simple terms?
Yeah. So in terms of bank and building society infrastructure, we utilise retail depositors, so the funds from our savings customers, our members, to fund our mortgages. And when we're funding our mortgages, over, I think, from the building society sector, 40% of first-time buyers specifically were supported by that, amongst other purchase activity and remortgage activity. So actually, if we start to see a more constrained supply of that, that could have other downstream consequences that I don't think we'd welcome.
What do you mean, increase in mortgage rates?
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
And Fairweather.
I think the first thing I'd say is what we don't...
Clear, because you don't provide cash ISAs, do you?
We do have a cash savings platform, actually. It's a small part of our business, but we provide a multi-bag platform there, so people can choose which cash ISA to put their money in through one sort of central,
It's not your main.
But but obviously, we were founded to democratise investment, to move more people, to get people to move their cash into investment. I think the first thing I'd say is stability in the system is incredibly important, and what we don't want to see is the run into every fiscal event or rumoured fiscal event, as this is now becoming, to be a discussion around what exactly these allowances are going to be. We saw in the run into the budget the negative impact of speculation around tax-free cash in pensions and how that drove irreversible behaviour in some cases by people making really important decisions around their retirement, but it being accelerated and driven by a timetable that wasn't actually related to their own finances. So I think the stability in the system is incredibly important. The last budget set the allowances through to 2030. And so that was obviously a promise that was made to people. There is going to be stability. Now, obviously, those allowances have eroded over time with inflation, but I think we see that as a positive, and we see it as a positive that you can move your money from a cash into a stocks and shares ISA very smoothly currently. And I think our focus in trying to encourage that investment culture will be very much on how you build confidence to do that, how we manage to make sure that those risk warnings have the right kind of contextual information, that people understand when investment's right for them, and how to make that balance between cash and investment.
And you rightly highlight the potential damage that speculation can cause, but I mean, who would you lay the blame for that speculation to? Because a lot of it was consumer finance journalists, people in the industry speculating. Or is there something that government should be doing? I mean, it's a complex picture.
I'd say in the run into the last budget, a number of options around pensions tax were ruled out, one way or the other. Even if it was just a Treasury spokesperson or something very inane, but ultimately there was no comment around tax-free cash, and that's why that kind of speculation continued. Certainly from our perspective, we were very clear with our clients that, if they're going to make long-term decisions about withdrawing from their pension, they need to think about that over the longer term, not the short term. But I think that's one of the real risks at the moment with this framework is if you want to encourage people to put money away for the longer term, whether it's into a pension, whether it's into an investment ISA, LISA, whatever it may be, we're asking people to take that risk into the future, as was rightly pointed out, with defined benefit schemes going, winding down, that risk lays with individuals. So I do think from a policy perspective, it's our responsibility to give people a clear framework and some kind of stability under which they're saving in.
Okay. A comment that it's hard for a chancellor or any government to rule out everything ahead of a fiscal event. So there is a sort of a difficult catch-22 situation there. Mr. Byrnes.
I'll be concise because I referenced this earlier, but we absolutely need to create an investing culture within the UK. The thousands of customers that I have advised or educated over the last 15 years who have told me that they're nervous about investing for such a wide multitude of reasons, it's very hard for me to imagine how a cut to the cash ISA allowance would make one of those people more comfortable and confident to start investing.
Thank you, that's really clear. Can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for the testimony, and our previous witnesses from the previous panel. We're going to go and think about a lot of this. It's too much for me to try and sum up, I think, in a couple of minutes. And thank you very much for the data and evidence you've already provided. And I know Ms Harrison and anyone else has got other data, please do provide that, because numbers talk, and we're really keen to see that information. And we will cogitate over this and be producing a report in due course. The transcript of this session and the previous one is available on the website in a couple of days' time, uncorrected. So thank you to our colleagues at Hansard for that, and thank you to our colleagues at Bowtie for the broadcasting services today. Thank you very much indeed. Order.